The emergency doors didn't open, they exploded. Dawn hadn't fully broken when the armored vehicles surrounded Mercy Ridge Medical Center like a siege formation. Boots hit concrete in perfect synchronization. Rifle muzzles swept through the pre-dawn darkness. Radios crackled with tactical brevity. And through it all, one name echoed through every channel, every shouted command, every agent's earpiece: Captain Hayes. Inside, a woman in faded pink scrubs stood at the nurse's station, her hand steady on a patient chart. She didn't flinch when the doors burst inward, didn't gasp when the red laser sights painted the walls around her, just lifted her eyes, calm, cold, calculating, and waited. The most terrifying part wasn't the guns. It was her face, like she'd been expecting this all along. Before we dive into this story, I need you to do something for me. Follow this channel to the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far Nora's story travels across the world. Now let's begin. 3 weeks earlier, the cruelest thing about Mercy Ridge Medical Center wasn't the fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, or the linoleum floors worn so thin you could see the concrete beneath. It was the way people looked through you. Nora Blake had perfected the art of being invisible. She worked the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when the world was at its quietest and its cruelest. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that seemed deliberately diminished, shoulders slightly hunched, gait marked by a barely perceptible limp that made her footsteps uneven against the tile. She wore no makeup, kept her hair in a simple ponytail, spoke only when absolutely necessary. The other nurses called her the ghost behind her back, not because she was scary, but because she seemed to haunt the hallways rather than inhabit them. On her first day, 3 months ago, the floor supervisor had made his assessment clear during the staff meeting. Derek Moss was 28, fresh from a management accelerator program, and possessed the special kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. He'd looked at Nora's resume, a patchwork of short-term positions at rural clinics, gaps in employment, a nursing degree from a school no one had heard of, and made his decision. "Look, Nora," he'd said, not bothering to lower his voice even though the entire team was present, "we're short-staffed, so we'll give you a shot. But this is a performance-based environment. You keep up, or you're out. Simple as that." She'd nodded once, said nothing. That had been his first mistake, assuming silence meant acceptance. The night shifts at Mercy Ridge were brutal by design. The hospital served the industrial east side of Ashford City, where factory workers with mangled hands arrived at 2 a.m., where overdoses peaked around 4, where domestic violence victims trickled in as bars closed. It was medicine at its rawest, and the overnight crew bore the weight of it alone. Nora took the hardest assignments without complaint. The combative patients, the ones covered in their own filth, the cases so hopeless that even seasoned nurses would hesitate before entering the room. She worked through her breaks, stayed late to finish charting, and never once asked for help. Derek noticed, but not in the way she might have hoped. "You know why she takes those cases?" he said to Jenna, one of the younger nurses, during a shift change 2 months in. Nora was 20 feet away, well within earshot, restocking a supply cart. "Because she's too slow and too stupid to do anything else. At least with the drunks and the homeless, nobody notices if she screws up." Jenna had laughed, nervous, performative, the kind of laugh that said she knew it was wrong but didn't have the courage to object. Nora's hands hadn't trembled, hadn't paused. She'd simply continued counting gauze packages, her face as empty as a blank page. But her eyes had flickered toward Derek for just a fraction of a second, and in that glance was something he was too arrogant to recognize. Assessment, calculation, the look of someone measuring an opponent and finding them lacking. The other nurses followed Derek's lead because that's what people do when someone claims authority loudly enough. They stopped inviting Nora to the break room, stopped asking her opinion during handoffs, started treating her like a piece of equipment, useful when needed, forgotten when not. Maya Chen was the exception. She was 62, had been a nurse for 40 years, and had seen enough workplace politics to recognize a railroading when she witnessed one. She tried to engage Nora during the quiet pre-dawn hours, asking about her background, her training, where she'd worked before. Nora's answers were always short, polite, and completely unrevealing. "Where'd you do your clinical rotations?" "Various places." "What made you choose night shift?" Scheduling worked out. You're good in crisis situations. Military background? A pause, just a heartbeat too long. No. Maya had let it drop, but she'd noticed the pause. And she'd noticed other things too. The way Nora could insert an IV on the first try, even in patients with impossible veins. The way she could estimate medication dosages faster than nurses with decades more experience. The way she moved through the ward with an efficiency that seemed almost tactical. But Maya kept her observations to herself. Everyone had a past. Some people earned the right to keep it buried. Derek Moss, meanwhile, had escalated from mockery to active sabotage. He began writing up Nora for minor infractions. Her charting was incomplete, even when it was more thorough than anyone else's. She was insubordinate for questioning an obviously incorrect medication order. She'd failed to follow protocol by stabilizing a critical patient before waiting for a doctor's authorization. Never mind that the patient would have died in the time it took to make a phone call. The write-ups piled up in her personnel file like kindling waiting for a match. 3 weeks before the dawn that would change everything, Derek called Nora into his office at the end of her shift. The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky outside, painting the cheap vertical blinds in shades of gray. He sat behind his desk like a judge, her file open in front of him. "This isn't working out," he said without preamble. "You've had 3 months to prove yourself, and frankly, you're a liability. I'm giving you 2 weeks' notice. You can resign, or I can terminate you. Your choice." Nora stood in front of his desk, still in her rumpled scrubs, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman receiving her professional death sentence with resignation. Derek saw compliance. Maya, watching from outside the office, saw something different in Nora's posture. Something coiled, controlled, dangerous in its stillness. "I'd like to continue working," Nora said quietly. Derek smirked. "Then consider this your final 2 weeks. Don't embarrass yourself by making me fire you." She nodded once and left without another word. In the parking lot, as dawn broke over Ashford City's skyline, Maya caught up with her. "You don't have to take this," Maya said. "File a complaint. Talk to HR. That was a setup from day one, and anyone with eyes can see it." Nora had turned to face her, and for just a moment Maya saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, but something colder, something tactical. "It's fine," Nora said. 2 weeks is enough time." Enough time for what? But Nora was already walking toward her car, that slight limp marking her steps, just another burned-out nurse heading home after another thankless shift. Maya watched her go and felt an inexplicable chill despite the warming morning air. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension. Derek grew increasingly bold in his contempt, making a show of reassigning Nora's patients to other nurses, excluding her from staff meetings. Once even suggesting she spend her shift cleaning supply closets, since that's about all you're good for. Nora endured it all with the same blank patience. She came in on time, did her work, said nothing. But Maya noticed she'd started arriving 30 minutes early, noticed she'd begun studying the hospital's emergency protocols, noticed the way Nora would pause sometimes in the hallways, her eyes tracking exit routes, counting doors, measuring distances with an intensity that had nothing to do with nursing. On Nora's second-to-last shift, a Friday night that bled into Saturday morning, the ward was unusually quiet. Too quiet. The kind of lull that made experienced nurses nervous. Derek spent most of the night in his office, working on what he claimed was important administrative work, but was actually a dating app, his feet propped on his desk. At 3:30 a.m., Nora was checking vitals on Mrs. Patterson, a 74-year-old recovering from pneumonia, when she heard it, a sound so faint that it barely registered, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles, too many of them, moving with purpose. Her head lifted, her hand stilled on Mrs. Patterson's wrist, fingers still measuring the pulse, but her attention was suddenly completely elsewhere. "What is it, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, noting the change in Nora's demeanor. "Nothing," Nora said, but her voice had shifted somehow, carrying an edge of authority that hadn't been there seconds before. "Try to get some rest." She moved to the window at the end of the hall, the one that overlooked the main entrance and parking lot. The pre-dawn darkness was still thick, but there were lights now moving in a coordinated pattern that was unmistakably tactical. Vehicles. Large ones. Pulling into formation. Nora's jaw tightened. Her hand moved unconsciously to her hip, reaching for something that wasn't there, stopping only when she realized what she was doing. Old instincts apparently died hard. She turned and walked quickly, not running, never running, but moving with a purpose that was nothing like the shuffling limp she normally affected, toward the nurse's station. Maya was there, working on charting. "Maya," Nora said quietly, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions." Maya looked up, startled by the tone. This wasn't the passive, invisible Nora who'd haunted the ward for 3 months. This was someone else entirely. "What's wrong?" "In approximately 90 seconds, this building is going to be surrounded. When that happens, I need you to start moving patients away from the windows and into interior rooms. Priority to the ones on ventilators and critical support. Can you do that?" "Surrounded by what?" "Nora, what are you—" "90 seconds, Nora repeated, and her eyes were hard as steel. "Trust me or don't, but people's lives are about to depend on what you do in the next few minutes." Maya stared at her for 3 heartbeats, then made a decision that would later save lives. "What do I tell Derek?" "Tell him to stay in his office and keep his head down." Then Nora was moving again, heading toward the main entrance with that same purposeful stride, and Maya was reaching for the phone to start calling in staff, her hands shaking but steady enough to dial. The vehicles arrived with military precision. 4 black SUVs formed a perimeter around the main entrance. 2 more blocked the service entrances. And behind them, something larger, an armored tactical truck that looked like it belonged in a war zone, not outside a civilian hospital in the middle of Ashford City. Derek emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion, his face shifting from confusion to something approaching panic as he saw the vehicles through the window. "What the hell is happening? Is this some kind of terrorist attack? We need to—" The emergency doors exploded inward. Not opened. Exploded. The pneumatic hinges never stood a chance against the battering ram that took them off their mounts in a shower of glass and metal. Armed federal agents poured through the gap like water through a broken dam, rifles up, moving in a choreographed assault pattern that was terrifying in its efficiency. "Federal agents, everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them."
Saucy, of course.
The night shift security guard, a 60-year-old former postal worker named Carl, reached for his radio and found himself face down on the linoleum with a boot on his back before he could press the button. Nurses screamed. A patient's call button began blaring. Somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor alarm went off. And through it all, Nora Blake stood at the nurse's station, completely still, her hands visible and empty, her face utterly calm. Derek was on the floor, hands over his head, hyperventilating. "Don't shoot, please don't shoot. I don't know anything. I'm just the supervisor." The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with gray at her temples and eyes that had seen too much, swept the room with her rifle, then lowered it slightly as her gaze landed on Nora. "We're looking for someone," the agent said, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Female, approximately 5'6", brown hair, works night shift." Derek, still face down, actually pointed at Nora without lifting his head. "Her! That's her, Nora Blake. She's useless anyway. Take her. Just please don't—" "Shut up," the agent said without looking at him. She approached Nora slowly, her hand moving to her sidearm but not drawing it. 2 other agents flanked her, maintaining tactical spacing. The entire team moved like a single organism, every person knowing exactly where every other person was at all times. "Ma'am," the lead agent said, "I'm going to need you to come with us." Nora met her eyes without flinching. "On what grounds?" "That's classified." "Then I respectfully decline." A muscle twitched in the agent's jaw. "This isn't a request. And this is a civilian medical facility, not a military base. You have no jurisdiction here without a warrant or probable cause. So either arrest me formally and read me my rights, or get your team out of my hospital before you cause any more trauma to patients who are already in crisis." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Derek stopped whimpering. The agent stared at Nora like she was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Taking in the cheap scrubs, the worn shoes, the carefully maintained posture of someone trying to be small and forgettable. And beneath all that, something else. Something that knew how tactical teams operated. Something that could recite federal law while staring down rifle barrels without a tremor in her voice. "You know your rights pretty well for a night shift nurse," the agent said quietly. "I watch a lot of legal dramas." Before the agent could respond, a code alarm screamed through the hospital PA system. "Code blue, room 317. Code blue, room 317. The voice was Maya's, tight with urgency. Room 317 was cardiac care. A 63-year-old man named Robert Chen, recovering from a triple bypass, stable when Nora had checked him an hour ago. She turned her head sharply toward the sound. Every fiber of her being suddenly focused in a new direction. The lead agent saw it, the shift in priority, the instantaneous recalculation. "Don't move!" But Nora was already moving, not toward the exits, but toward the stairwell that led to the third floor. One of the younger agents stepped into her path, rifle raised. "I said don't move!" "Then shoot me," Nora said, and her voice carried an authority that made the agent actually step back. "Because a man is dying upstairs, and every second you waste pointing guns at me is a second he doesn't have." She walked past him like he wasn't there. The lead agent made a split-second decision. "Henderson, Rodriguez, with her. Everyone else, secure the floor." Nora hit the stairs at a run, the limp completely gone now, taking steps two at a time with the kind of speed that spoke of training and muscle memory. The two agents followed, struggling to keep up, their heavy gear slowing them down. She reached the third floor in under 20 seconds. The hallway was chaos. Nurses running, a crash cart being wheeled at breakneck speed, alarms blaring from multiple rooms. Maya was at the door to 317, her face pale. He arrested, no pulse, no respiration. Started CPR, but he's not responding. Nora was past her before she finished speaking. Robert Chen was on his back, another nurse, Jenna, performing chest compressions with the desperate rhythm of someone who knew she was losing. The cardiac monitor showed a flat line broken only by the compression artifacts. Nora didn't break stride. "How long?" 2 minutes, maybe less. "Stop compressions." Jenna looked up, confused. "What?" "But stop, now." The authority in Nora's voice was absolute. Jenna stopped, stepping back, and Nora took her place at the bedside. She placed her hands on Robert's chest, but not in the standard position for CPR. Lower, angled differently, her fingers finding landmarks with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times in conditions far worse than a hospital room. "Bag him," she said to Maya, who moved immediately to position the bag valve mask. 2 breaths, then pause. The federal agents had reached the doorway, weapons lowered but still present. They watched as Nora worked with a clinical precision that seemed almost supernatural. She checked Robert's pupils, assessed his airway, felt for pulses in places most nurses never thought to check. And then she did something that made Jenna gasp. She drew back her fist and struck Robert's chest hard, directly over the sternum. "What are you doing?" Jenna shrieked. The monitor blipped. Once, twice. Again, Nora said, and delivered another strike, this one even harder. The monitor jumped. The flat line broke into something irregular, chaotic, but unmistakably electrical activity. "Sinus rhythm," Maya breathed. "My God, she got him back." Nora was already moving, checking IV lines, adjusting oxygen flow, her hands working with mechanical efficiency. "Get crash cart meds ready. Epinephrine and atropine, stand by. And someone call cardiology, tell them we need a consult immediately. Patient just converted from a systole via precordial thump." Robert's eyes fluttered. His chest rose and fell with Maya's assisted breaths, but there was movement now, effort, the beginnings of spontaneous respiration. The lead federal agent stood in the doorway, her weapon now fully lowered, staring at Nora with an expression that was part shock, part recognition. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked quietly. Nora didn't look up from her patient. "Nursing school. That's not in any nursing curriculum." "Then I guess I'm a quick learner." Robert's breathing strengthened. His pulse stabilized. The monitor showed a rhythm that was still irregular, but growing stronger with each passing second. Against every odd, against statistical probability, he was alive. Nora stepped back, her scrubs soaked with sweat, her hands finally beginning to tremble. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that follows near impossible saves. The agent walked into the room slowly, carefully, like approaching a wild animal. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a photograph, the edges worn from handling. She held it up where Nora could see it. The photograph showed a woman in military uniform standing in front of a medical tent, sand and mountains visible in the background. The woman had the same facial structure as Nora, the same eyes, but there was no limp, no hunched shoulders, no effort to be invisible. This woman stood like she owned the ground beneath her feet. The nameplate on the uniform was clearly visible, Captain M. Hayes. "Nursing school," the agent said softly. "Right." Nora looked at the photograph for a long moment, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "Actually," the agent said, "that's the problem. Someone thinks she does. And they've just taken an entire city block hostage until we hand her over." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Maya, still holding the bag valve mask, stared at Nora with an expression of complete incomprehension. "What is she talking about? Nora, what?" Derek's voice crackled over the radio one of the agents was carrying. "They're asking for someone named Hayes, Captain Hayes. They're saying if we don't produce her in 2 hours, they start killing hostages." Nora closed her eyes. Just for a second. And in that second, the careful construction of 3 months, the limp, the silence, the invisibility, cracked like ice under pressure. When she opened her eyes again, they were different, harder, clearer, the eyes of someone who'd made impossible decisions in impossible situations and somehow managed to keep breathing. "Where?" she asked. "The Blackstone building," the agent said. 17 hostages, armed perpetrators, unknown number. And they're asking for you by name, rank, and service number." "That's not possible. I'm dead, officially. I have the paperwork." "So did we. Until 3 hours ago, when someone who knows exactly who you are decided to bring you back to life." The agent holstered her weapon fully. "My name is Special Agent Sarah Trent, and whether you like it or not, Captain Hayes, you're about to become visible again." In the distance, sirens began to wail. Police, SWAT, emergency services converging on a crisis that had just escalated from a nursing shift to a federal incident. Nora looked down at Robert Chen, breathing steadily now, alive against all odds. Then at Maya, whose face showed betrayal and confusion. Then at the photograph in Agent Trent's hand, evidence of a life she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed. "I need 5 minutes," Nora said. "You have 2. Then we'd better move fast." She walked out of the room, no longer limping, no longer trying to be small. The federal agents parted to let her pass, and Derek, still on the floor in the hallway where they'd left him, stared up at her with dawning terror as he realized he'd been mocking a ghost. A ghost that was about to become very, very real. And somewhere across the city, in the Blackstone building, a man with a weapon and a grudge was watching the clock count down, waiting for the woman he'd summoned to appear. The elevator descended in silence so thick it felt like a physical presence. Nora stood with her back to the corner, old habits emerging like muscle memory, while Agent Trent occupied the opposite corner, maintaining tactical spacing even in the confined space. 2 other agents flanked the doors, hands resting on their sidearms. "The Blackstone building was evacuated 2 months ago," Trent said without preamble. "Asbestos remediation, scheduled for demolition next quarter. At 0300 this morning, a maintenance crew doing final inspections found the building occupied. 17 people zip-tied to support columns in the main lobby. Armed individuals, we're estimating 4 to 6 based on thermal imaging, positioned throughout the structure." "Demands?" Nora's voice was flat, professional, completely devoid of the hesitant softness she'd carried for 3 months. "Just one. You. They gave us your full military service number, deployment history, and the exact coordinates of your last known operation." Trent paused. "An operation that officially never happened, in a country we officially weren't in." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto a scene of controlled chaos. The hospital's main entrance had been transformed into a command center. Laptop screens glowed with surveillance feeds. A tactical map of the city sprawled across a hastily assembled table. Federal agents in body armor moved with purpose, while local police maintained a perimeter that was already attracting news crews like sharks to blood. Derek stood near the wall, his earlier smugness replaced by wide-eyed shock as he watched Nora walk past him. No limp now, posture straight, moving like someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones. She didn't even glance in his direction. He'd become what he'd made her, invisible. A man in his 50s separated from the command cluster, his gray suit impeccable despite the hour, his face carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd been awakened to handle a nightmare. The ID hanging from his neck identified him as Deputy Director Marcus Webb, FBI. "Captain Hayes," he said, and the name landed like a stone in still water. Several nearby officers turned to stare. Or should I say Nora Blake? Nora Blake is fine. That's who I am now. That's who you were trying to be. Webb gestured toward the command table. Unfortunately, someone from your past disagrees. The tactical map showed the Blackstone building in satellite detail, a 12-story Art Deco structure in the warehouse district, isolated from residential areas, perfect for both an ambush and a standoff. Red markers indicated hostage positions. Blue markers showed law enforcement staging areas. And in the center, a single yellow marker pulsed like a heartbeat. "They've got someone on the roof with a rifle," Webb explained. "Sniper-grade equipment, military precision in the setup. Every approach vector is covered. We can't move without them seeing us coming." Nora studied the map with the same intensity she'd once used to assess battlefield medicine scenarios. "The hostages. Who are they?" Trent pulled up photographs on a tablet. Random selection. Night security guard. Homeless individuals who were using the building for shelter. A couple of urban explorers with cameras. Wrong place. Catastrophically wrong time. They're innocent? Completely. This wasn't about them. It was about bait. Trent swiped to a new image, and Nora's breath caught. The photograph showed a man in his early 40s, dark hair going silver at the temples, eyes that carried the particular deadness of someone who'd crossed too many moral lines to ever find their way back. He wore civilian clothes in the image, but the bearing was unmistakably military. "Vincent Keller," Webb said. "Ring any bells?" Nora's jaw tightened. "Yes?" "Care to elaborate?" He was a contractor, private security. His team provided transport and logistics support during Operation Sand Viper. She paused, choosing her words with surgical precision, until they didn't. According to our intelligence, Keller's operation went sideways after a supply convoy was ambushed. 17 soldiers died. The investigation suggested inside information. Someone sold coordinates to hostile forces. Webb's eyes never left her face. "You were the lead investigator." "I was a field medic, who also served as the ranking medical officer with command authority when the actual CO was killed in the initial attack, which meant you had access to everything: communications logs, personnel files, financial records." Webb leaned forward. "What did you find?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, the past she'd buried clawed its way back to the surface. Evidence that Keller's security team had been selling intelligence for 8 months. Supply routes, patrol schedules, weapon caches. They turned the entire region into a kill zone for profit. "But you couldn't prove it." "I proved it. I just couldn't get anyone to listen before Keller and his team disappeared into the contractor protection program. New identities, new country, immunity deals in exchange for testimony about other operations." The bitterness in her voice was caustic. "They walked. The families of the 17 soldiers who died got folded flags and empty promises." Trent and Webb exchanged glances. Webb pulled up another file, this one stamped with classification markers that made the nearby police officers suddenly very interested in looking elsewhere. "Keller resurfaced 6 months ago," Webb said. "Freelance work, mostly Eastern Europe. Wet work, the kind of jobs that don't make it into official reports. Then 3 weeks ago, he went dark. No communications, no credit card usage, no digital footprint." He pulled up the final image. Recent surveillance footage showing Keller entering the Blackstone building. "Until this morning. He's been planning this." Nora's voice was quiet but certain, waiting for the right moment. "The question is why now? You've been dead for 2 years officially. You created a new life, buried yourself so deep that even our best analysts couldn't have found you without significant resources." Webb's expression was grim. Someone told him where you were. The implications of that statement rippled through Nora like electricity. She'd been careful, meticulous. Every detail of her disappearance had been planned and executed with the same precision she'd once used to triage casualties under fire, and yet someone had found her. He wants revenge, Nora said. He wants vindication, Webb corrected. The message he sent with the hostage demand was specific. He claims you fabricated evidence, that you're the real traitor, that you need to confess publicly or he starts executing innocent people to prove his point. That's insane. That's trauma and obsession with 2 years to ferment. Trent pulled up a psychological profile. Keller's had 3 documented psychotic breaks since going into hiding. His contractor immunity deal fell apart when his testimony contradicted itself. He's broke, blacklisted, and convinced that you destroyed his life. I documented his crimes. He destroyed his own life. Try explaining that to a man with 17 hostages and nothing left to lose. A young agent approached, tablet in hand, face pale. Sir, we just received another transmission from the building. Webb took the tablet. The screen showed grainy video footage. The Blackstone building's lobby, visible through what must have been a hostage's confiscated phone. The 17 people were visible, zip-tied to support columns, faces terrified. And standing in the center of the frame, holding a pistol loosely at his side, was Vincent Keller. He looked worse than his photograph suggested. Thinner, eyes sunken, the kind of deterioration that spoke of sleepless nights and substance abuse. Captain Hayes, Keller's voice crackled through the tablet's speakers. I know you're listening. I know they found you. And I know you're going to do exactly what I tell you, because that's who you are. The hero. The savior. The one who can't stand to let innocent people die. He gestured to the nearest hostage, a young woman who was sobbing quietly. You have 90 minutes. Come alone, unarmed, ready to tell the world the truth about Sand Viper, or I start with her. The feed cut out. The command center erupted in urgent discussion, tactical options, negotiation strategies, assault scenarios. But Nora stood perfectly still, her mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating odds and outcomes with the cold precision of someone trained to make impossible choices. We go in hard, one of the SWAT commanders was saying. Breaching charges on 3 entry points, flashbangs, overwhelming force. And 17 dead hostages before you make it past the lobby, Nora interrupted. Her voice cut through the discussion like a scalpel. Keller was special operations before he went private. He'll have shaped charges on the support columns, probably dead man switches. The second he sees you coming, he brings the building down on everyone inside. You can't possibly know that. I know him. He's not suicidal, but he's willing to die if it means taking me with him. This isn't about survival. It's about making me pay. She turned to Webb. He wants a confession. What if I give him one? Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with... I'm not talking about negotiation. I'm talking about buying time and getting close enough to end this. Trent stepped forward. You're suggesting we let you walk in there. I'm suggesting you don't have a choice. Every minute we waste planning an assault is a minute closer to him executing someone. You need me to go in, and we both know it. Webb's expression was conflicted. Even if I agreed, and I'm not saying I do, you're a civilian now. You have no training for hostage rescue, no authority to conduct tactical operations on U.S. and Bataan soil, and no legal protection if this goes wrong. Nora met his eyes with a level stare that carried the weight of 100 battlefield decisions. I had 3 tours in combat zones where I performed field surgery under fire, coordinated evacuations through hostile territory, and made life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no backup. I'm more qualified for this than anyone else in this room. She's right, Trent said quietly. Webb shot her a look, but she continued. Keller wants her specifically. He's planned for law enforcement response, probably has countermeasures for everything we could throw at him, but he's not planning for her to actually show up. That's our advantage. He thinks she's been hiding because she's guilty. He's not expecting someone who's ready to fight. We'd need to wire you, Webb said. And Nora could hear the capitulation in his voice. Audio and video, live feed back to command, and you'd need to wear body armor. No armor. He'll check, he'll expect it, and he'll use it as proof that I'm not operating in good faith. That's suicide. That's tactics. Nora turned back to the map, her finger tracing potential entry points. I go in through the main entrance, visible approach, hands up. He'll want to search me, establish dominance. That's when I get him talking, get details about his setup, locations of his team, position of the hostages. And then what? Webb asked. You're unarmed, surrounded by hostiles, with no backup plan. Nora's smile was thin and cold. Then I improvise. It's kind of my specialty. 20 minutes later, she stood in a converted hospital room that had been hastily repurposed as a staging area. Her scrubs were gone, replaced by dark jeans and a plain black shirt that fit close enough to prove she wasn't wearing armor, but loose enough to allow movement. A female FBI technician worked quickly, threading a nearly invisible wire along her collar, securing a button-sized camera to her shirt. It's voice-activated, the technician explained. We'll hear everything, see everything, but if they run a scanner, they'll find it. Then I'll have to make sure they don't look too carefully. Maya appeared in the doorway, still in her scrubs, her face a complicated mixture of concern and something that might have been awe. I don't understand any of this. 3 months, and you never said a word. You let Derek treat you like someone who deserved to be invisible, Nora finished. Because I did. I wanted to disappear. Wanted to be someone who saved lives without the weight of military operations and impossible choices. She paused, checking the wire's position in a mirror. Turns out the past doesn't care what you want. You could have told me. Could I? What would you have done with that information? Would it have changed anything, or would it just have given you one more secret to carry? Nora turned to face her. I'm sorry I lied, but I'm not sorry I tried to leave that life behind. And now? Now I finish what I started. Nora accepted a small earpiece from Trent, fitting it deep enough to be invisible but shallow enough to function. Keep Robert stable. Make sure the ward is locked down. And Maya, she met the older nurse's eyes. Thank you for not asking questions for 3 months. That silence gave me something I hadn't had in years. What's that? Peace. The ride to the Blackstone building took 12 minutes through pre-dawn streets that were being systematically evacuated. Police had established a perimeter 3 blocks out, redirecting what little traffic existed at this hour. News helicopters circled at a distance, their cameras capturing footage that would dominate every channel by morning. Nora sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, Trent driving, Webb in the passenger seat. The command frequency chattered in her earpiece, tactical teams positioning, snipers finding angles, negotiators standing by for communication attempts that everyone knew wouldn't work. We've got assets in position, Webb said without turning around. Rooftop overwatch on 3 surrounding buildings. Thermal imaging shows 4 distinct heat signatures inside, plus the 17 hostages on the ground floor. If this goes bad, if he even looks like he's going to harm you or the hostages, we're coming in. If you come in, people die. That's not a threat. It's mathematics. Keller's too smart and too damaged to leave obvious openings. Then why are we doing this? Because I'm the variable he didn't account for. He remembers the medic who documented his crimes. He doesn't know what I became after that. The SUV stopped 3 blocks from the target. Nora stepped out into the cool, pre-dawn air, the city around her holding its breath. In the distance, the Blackstone building loomed like a tombstone against the lightening sky, its windows dark except for the faint glow emanating from the lobby. Trent handed her a radio. Last chance to reconsider. We can try negotiation. Wait him out. He's not negotiating. He's executing a plan that's been 2 years in the making. Nora clipped the radio to her belt, knowing she'd probably have to surrender it within minutes. When this is over, there's a personnel file at Mercy Ridge that needs to be corrected. Derek Moss has been filing false reports and creating a hostile work environment. I'd appreciate it if someone made sure that's addressed. Worried about your nursing career right now? Worried about making sure he can't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. Nora started walking, her stride steady and sure. Some bullies need to learn that the people they underestimate are the most dangerous. She walked alone down the empty street, hands visible and empty, heading toward a building full of armed hostiles and terrified innocents. The rising sun painted long shadows across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour. 83 minutes remained on Keller's deadline. The Blackstone building's main entrance was a masterpiece of Art Deco architecture now fallen into disrepair, brass fixtures tarnished, marble cracked, glass doors held together with duct tape in desperation. Nora approached slowly, her hands raised to shoulder height, making herself as non-threatening as possible. The doors opened from the inside. A man in tactical gear emerged, assault rifle pointed at her center mass. He was younger than Keller, maybe 30, with the hard eyes of someone who'd learned violence as a profession. "Stop there, don't move." Nora stopped 10 feet from the entrance. "I'm here to talk to Keller, unarmed, alone, like he asked. Turn around, slow." She complied, rotating in a full circle, demonstrating the absence of weapons. The man approached, rifle never wavering, and conducted a rough search that was more intimidation than thoroughness. He found the radio immediately. "What's this?" "Communication, in case your boss wants to talk to the people outside." He crushed it under his boot, ran a handheld scanner over her body, basic electromagnetic detection, looking for weapons or recording devices. The scanner passed over the button camera twice, and Nora felt her heart rate spike. But the device was small enough and shielded enough that the scanner didn't register it. "She's clear," the man called back into the building. "Send her in." Keller's voice, distorted by distance, but unmistakably him. The lobby was exactly as the video had shown. 17 people zip-tied to support columns in a rough circle, their faces tracking Nora's entrance with desperate hope. The space was vast, echoing, designed for crowds that would never fill it again. Morning light filtered through grimy windows, painting everything in shades of gray. Vincent Keller stood in the center of it all, a gun in each hand, one pointed casually at the nearest hostage, the other tracking Nora's approach. "Captain Hayes," he said, and his voice carried the brittle edge of someone barely holding on to sanity. "Or should I call you Nora?" "I have to say the disguise was good. Night shift nurse, mousy and forgettable. If I hadn't paid a very expensive hacker to cross-reference every medical facility within 500 miles against facial recognition databases, I might never have found you." Nora stopped 20 feet away, hands still raised. "You found me. I'm here. Let the hostages go." "You think it works that way? You show up and I just release everyone and we have a nice conversation about the past?" Keller laughed and the sound was jagged. "You destroyed everything I built. My career, my reputation, my life. Because of your report, I lost contracts worth millions, lost colleagues, lost respect, lost my mind for a while, if we're being honest. You lost those things because you sold intelligence that got 17 soldiers killed. I provided information to interested parties as part of a complex geopolitical negotiation that you were too naive to understand. You took money to betray people who trusted you." Keller's face twisted. "I took payment for services rendered in a war zone where loyalties shift like sand. You want to talk about betrayal? Let's talk about how you fabricated evidence, how you manipulated testimony, how you destroyed a man's life because you needed someone to blame for your own command failures." In her earpiece, Webb's voice was urgent but controlled. "Keep him talking. Thermal imaging shows 2 more hostiles on the 2nd floor, watching the street, 1 on the roof. We need positions and movements." Nora took a careful step forward, drawing Keller's attention. "I documented what happened. Radio intercepts, financial transfers, testimony from survivors. That wasn't fabrication, that was investigation." "Investigation," Keller spat the word. "You were a medic playing detective. You had no authority, no training, no right to—" "I had 17 body bags that said otherwise." Nora's voice was sharp now, cutting through his justifications. 17 soldiers who died because someone told the enemy exactly where they'd be. You want to talk about authority? I had the authority of watching people I'd served with bleed out in the sand while you counted money from their deaths. One of the hostages, the young security guard, made a small sound of terror as Keller's gun hand twitched. Nora immediately shifted her posture, becoming less aggressive, recognizing she'd pushed too hard. "I'm not here to argue," she said, forcing her voice calmer. "You wanted me to come, to hear your side. I'm listening." Keller studied her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation behind his eyes, trying to determine if this was genuine or tactical. Finally, he lowered the gun pointing at the hostage, though he kept it ready. "The truth," he said, "is that war makes everyone dirty. You think those soldiers were innocent? They were participants in an occupation that created the very insurgency that killed them. I didn't create that situation. I just profited from recognizing its inevitability. So it's their fault they died? It's no one's fault. It's war, chaos. And in chaos, some people survive and some don't. I chose survival. He gestured with the gun toward her. You chose righteousness, documented my crimes, got me blacklisted, forced me into hiding. And for what? Did those 17 soldiers come back to life? Did anything change? Justice changed. Accountability changed. Justice. Keller's laugh was bitter. You're standing in a condemned building with hostages and armed men, about to die for your precious justice. Tell me how righteous you feel now. Movement on the second-floor balcony caught Nora's peripheral vision, one of Keller's team repositioning, and in that motion, she cataloged details. Military bearing, but sloppy discipline. Good equipment, but poor maintenance. These weren't elite operators. They were desperate men following a deteriorating leader. I feel, Nora said carefully, like a woman who tried to do the right thing and paid the price for it. I died, Keller. Officially. I gave up everything to escape what that investigation cost me. You think you're the only one who lost something? I lost my career, my identity, every relationship I'd built. I became a ghost because living was too hard. For the first time, something flickered across Keller's face that might have been doubt. You expect me to feel sorry for you? I expect you to recognize that we're both casualties of a system that chews people up and spits them out when they become inconvenient. The difference is, I didn't try to take innocent people down with me. These people aren't innocent. Nobody is. They're 17 human beings who have nothing to do with our past. Letting them go doesn't change what happened between us. No, Keller agreed, but killing them will finally make you understand what loss feels like. He raised the gun toward the young security guard, and time seemed to slow. Nora saw his finger tightening on the trigger, saw the terror in the guard's eyes, saw the exact angle and distance, and knew with absolute certainty that she could close the gap before he fired, but that doing so would trigger a response from his team that would end with everyone dead. So she did the only thing she could think of. She told him the truth. I know what loss feels like, she said, and her voice carried a rawness that stopped his finger just short of full trigger pull. I was there when they died. All 17. I triaged them, operated on them, held their hands while they bled out on gurneys because we didn't have enough supplies or personnel or time. I watched them die and I couldn't save them, and that failure is something I carry every single day. Keller's hand wavered. You want me to confess? Nora continued, and now there were tears on her face, real ones, dredged up from a place she'd kept locked for 2 years. Fine. I confess that I failed them, that I wasn't good enough or fast enough or smart enough to save them all. I confess that I spent the next year investigating every detail of their deaths, because the alternative was admitting that sometimes people just die, and there's no reason, no justice, just blood and sand and the sound of someone's last breath. Stop. Keller's voice was rough. I confess that finding out you sold them out was almost a relief, because it meant their deaths had a cause, had meaning, had someone to blame. It meant I wasn't just a failed medic watching good people die for nothing. She took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate movements. You want to kill these people to hurt me? You're too late. I'm already hurt. We're both already destroyed. The question is whether we destroy anyone else on our way down. She was 10 feet away now, close enough to see the deterioration in his face, the tremor in his hands that spoke of withdrawal or stress or both. Close enough to see that this man wasn't a monster. He was broken, like she'd been broken. Like everyone who'd survived that war had been broken in different ways. You're lying, Keller said, but there was no conviction in it. I'm not. Search my face. You were special operations. You know how to read people. Look at me and tell me I'm lying about the guilt, the failure, the nights I wake up hearing screams that aren't there anymore. Keller stared at her, and for a moment the gun lowered. For a moment she saw the possibility of ending this without more death. Then one of his team members, the jumpy one on the balcony, shouted a warning. Boss, SWAT team repositioning on the west side. They're moving into assault positions. The moment shattered. Keller's face hardened and the gun snapped back up, this time pointed directly at Nora's chest. "You brought them," he said, and all the fragile connection they'd built evaporated like morning fog. This was all just a stalling tactic. "I came alone." "You came wired and followed and backed by every federal agency in the city." His voice rose to a shout. "Did you really think I was stupid enough to believe you'd sacrifice yourself? You're a survivor, Hayes, just like me. You do what you have to do to make it through." In her earpiece, "Nora, get down. We're coming in." "No," she shouted, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to Keller or Webb or the universe itself. "Nobody moves. Vincent, listen to me." But he was past listening. She could see it in his eyes, the moment when damaged rationality gave way to desperate action. His finger was tightening on the trigger, the hostages were screaming, and somewhere in the building, shaped charges were probably rigged to bring it all down. Nora had maybe 2 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether 17 innocent people lived or died. So she made it. She moved. Not backward to safety, but forward, directly into Keller's line of fire, closing the distance with the kind of speed that came from muscle memory and countless hours of combat training. His gun tracked her movement, but she was inside his effective range before he could adjust, her hand coming up to deflect the barrel just as he fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the heat of its passage. And then she was on him, using every dirty fighting technique she'd learned in field training, targeting pressure points and weak spots with clinical precision. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. Keller was larger, stronger, trained in the same systems she was. But he was also damaged, running on rage and stimulants and 2 years of deteriorating mental health. Nora was running on something else entirely. The absolute certainty that she would not let anyone else die because of their shared past. They grappled across the floor, each fighting for control of the weapon. Keller's team was shouting, trying to get a clear shot, but they couldn't fire without risking hitting their leader. The hostages screamed and strained against their zip ties, unable to flee, forced to watch the violent struggle happening feet away from them. "Stand down!" Webb's voice in her earpiece, distant and urgent. "Federal agents moving in." The main doors exploded inward, not with a battering ram this time, but with breaching charges that took them off their hinges in a shower of debris and smoke. Tactical teams poured through, weapons up, shouting commands that added to the chaos. But Nora couldn't focus on any of that. Her entire world had narrowed to this moment, this struggle, this one final confrontation with a ghost from her past. Keller's elbow caught her in the ribs. She felt something crack, but ignored it. Drove her knee into his thigh, deadening the muscle. Got her hand on his wrist, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would make his fingers spasm open. The gun clattered to the floor. For one heartbeat, they both froze, staring at each other across inches of space. She could see in his eyes the recognition that it was over, that he'd lost, that whatever revenge he'd planned had crumbled in the face of someone who refused to let fear win. "It's done," she said quietly, just for him. "It's over." Then the tactical team was on them, pulling them apart, securing Keller with expert efficiency while 2 agents helped Nora to her feet. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she stayed standing, refused to show weakness. Not now. Around the lobby, agents were cutting zip ties, freeing hostages who collapsed in relief and terror and gratitude. The young security guard was sobbing. An older homeless man was thanking God. And through it all, Nora stood in the center of the chaos she'd created and prevented, watching her past being handcuffed and read as rights. Trent appeared at her side, her expression a complicated mixture of respect and concern. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Can it be both? "Are you hurt?" "Cracked rib, maybe 2. "I'll live." Nora watched as Keller was led away, his face empty now, defeated. The others, his team, surrendered the moment we breached. They were hired help, not true believers. Without Keller's leadership, they folded immediately. Trent paused. "You could have waited for us. We would have extracted you." "And how many hostages would have died in the crossfire? How many agents? This way, everyone goes home." She winced as pain flared through her side, mostly intact. Medical teams were flooding in now, assessing hostages, checking vital signs. Nora watched them work with a professional eye, noting who was handling trauma correctly and who was just going through motions. Old habits apparently didn't just die hard, they were immortal. Webb approached, his face unreadable. That was not the plan. The plan was to buy time and create an opening. I did both. The plan did not include hand-to-hand combat with an armed suspect. The next time, write a better plan. Nora met his eyes without flinching. Did anyone die? No. Then it worked. Webb stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're either the luckiest person I've ever met or the most skilled. I honestly can't tell which. Maybe I'm just someone who's tired of running. Nora glanced toward the doors where dawn light was now streaming in, painting everything in shades of gold. I spent 2 years trying to be invisible, trying to escape what happened in that desert. Turns out you can't outrun your past. You can only face it and decide who you want to be on the other side. And who do you want to be? Before Nora could answer, one of the paramedics called out, a young woman's voice, urgent and professional. We need a nurse over here. This man's going into cardiac arrest. Nora was moving before she consciously made the decision, crossing to where the young security guard was suddenly convulsing, his eyes rolling back, foam at his lips. The paramedic was good but young, uncertain, reaching for protocols while the patient's life ticked away in seconds. Move, Nora said, not unkindly, but with absolute authority. She dropped to her knees beside the guard, her hands already assessing, checking airway, pulse, pupil response. He's seizing, could be stress-induced, could be underlying condition exacerbated by trauma. I've got it, the paramedic started. You've got 2 years of experience and a textbook understanding. I've got battlefield medicine and more saves than you've had patients. Now get me diazepam, 5 milligrams IV, and prepare for possible intubation. The young paramedic hesitated, then saw something in Nora's eyes that made the decision for her. She moved to comply. Nora worked with the same focused intensity she'd shown with Robert Chen hours earlier, the same intensity she'd carried through 3 combat tours and 100 impossible situations. The guard's seizure was subsiding under her care, his vitals stabilizing, his breathing becoming less labored. Around her, federal agents and local police and freed hostages all watched a woman in civilian clothes save a life with the casual competence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Webb, standing at the periphery, turned to Trent. Who is she, really? Trent was quiet for a moment, watching Nora work. Someone who tried to forget she was a soldier. Someone who's about to remember she never stopped being one. The guard's eyes fluttered open. He saw Nora's face above him and managed a weak smile. Are we? You're alive. Everyone's alive. You're going to be fine, she signaled the paramedic. Transport him to Mercy Ridge. Tell them to run a full cardiac workup and neurological assessment. This might be stress-related, but I want to rule out underlying pathology. Yes, ma'am, the paramedic said, and there was respect in her voice now. Nora stood slowly, her cracked ribs protesting every movement, and found herself the center of attention. Agents who'd dismissed her as just another civilian asset were reassessing. Hostages who'd been saved twice now, once from Keller, once from medical crisis, were looking at her like she was something more than human. Derek's voice echoed in her memory. She's useless anyway. She almost laughed at the irony, but the pain in her ribs made that inadvisable. The sun was fully up now, painting Ashford City in the warm light of a new day. News helicopters circled like vultures, cameras capturing everything. By noon, this would be national news. By evening, international. The woman who came back from the dead to save 17 hostages. The nurse who was really a soldier. The ghost who became real. Nora Blake, Captain Mara Hayes. Both. Neither. Someone new, forged in the intersection of who she'd been and who she'd tried to become. Trent approached again, this time holding a blanket. Ambulance is waiting. You need to get those ribs checked properly. I need to get back to work. My shift doesn't end for another hour. Your shift ended the moment you walked into this building. You're on administrative leave, minimum 1 week, possibly longer, depending on whether anyone bothers to ask what a dead soldier was doing working as a nurse in the first place. Nora's voice was quiet but edged with steel. Whether anyone wants to know why someone with my training and experience was content to be invisible and underestimated and mocked by a supervisor who couldn't find his own ass with both hands and a map? Trent's expression softened. Fair point. But you're still getting in that ambulance. Fine, but I'm coming back, to Mercy Ridge, to my patients, to the life I built before all this. She paused. Assuming I still have a job. Something tells me your employment status is the least of your worries right now. As if to punctuate that statement, Webb's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, his face growing progressively more grim. When he hung up, he looked at Nora with an expression that was equal parts concern and something that might have been awe. That was Washington, he said quietly. Seems your little resurrection has attracted attention at the highest levels. The intelligence community is very interested in talking to someone who officially died 2 years ago, but just saved 17 hostages from a terrorist situation. Keller wasn't a terrorist, he was a broken man with a vendetta. The distinction matters less than you'd think. Either way, you're about to become very visible, very quickly. The question is whether you're ready for that. Nora looked around at the scene, the freed hostages being treated by paramedics, the federal agent securing the building, the morning light streaming through broken windows onto a floor where, minutes ago, people had prepared to die. She thought about Robert Chen breathing steadily in his hospital room, about Maya, who trusted her instincts, about 3 months of being invisible, underestimated, dismissed as useless. I stopped being ready the moment I decided to save lives instead of taking them, she said. But ready or not, here I am. The ambulance was waiting outside, its lights painting the street in alternating red and white. Nora started walking toward it, her pace measured despite the pain, her head high despite everything. Behind her, in the Blackstone building, evidence teams were already at work, documenting everything, preserving the scene for trials and investigations that would take months or years to complete. And in a holding cell somewhere in the federal building, Vincent Keller sat with his head in his hands, confronting the reality that revenge hadn't brought him peace, only the certainty that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. The ambulance doors closed, but before they did, Nora heard something that made her pause. A phone ringing in Trent's pocket. The agent answered, listened, her face going pale. Are you certain? Trent said into the phone. All of them? Jesus Christ. She hung up and turned to Webb, her voice urgent. We have a problem. Keller wasn't the primary. He was a diversion. Webb's face went stone. Explain. While we were focused here, someone hit 3 major infrastructure points across the city: water treatment, power grid, and the main hospital's medication storage. Trent's hand was shaking as she pulled up a map on her tablet. Initial reports suggest biological contamination in the water supply. Estimated exposure, 70,000 people in the next 6 hours. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. 70,000 people. Biological contamination. 6 hours. Webb was already shouting orders, calling in every available resource, but Nora barely heard it. Her mind was racing through protocols, through training, through every bioterror scenario she'd studied in military medical courses. Trent turned to her, and in her eyes was a question that didn't need to be spoken. Can you help? Nora thought about her cracked ribs, about her exhaustion, about the fact that she'd just fought an armed man and talked down a hostage situation and saved a life all before sunrise. She thought about going home, getting rest, letting someone else handle the next crisis. Then she thought about 70,000 people who had no idea their morning coffee might kill them. Get me to a phone, she said, and find me whoever's in charge of the CDC regional office. We've got work to do. The ambulance doors closed, but they were no longer transporting a patient. They were transporting a weapon. And somewhere in Ashford City, as dawn fully broke and people woke to what they thought would be an ordinary day, a biological time bomb was already ticking. The CDC's Regional Mobile Command Center arrived 18 minutes later, a converted semi-trailer that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film. All sealed compartments, negative pressure environments, and enough biohazard equipment to handle an apocalypse. Dr. Sarah Chen, the regional director, was a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her black hair and the exhausted competence of someone who'd spent 30 years preparing for a nightmare she'd hoped would never come. She took one look at Nora, still in civilian clothes, visible bruising forming along her jaw from the fight with Keller, moving carefully because of cracked ribs, and her expression hardened. "You're the military medic they told me about?" "Former. And yes." Nora accepted the tablet Chen thrust at her, scanning the preliminary reports with growing dread. Water treatment plant 3 was compromised at 0400. Security footage shows two individuals in maintenance uniforms accessing the chlorination system. They were inside for 8 minutes, long enough to introduce a biological agent into the main reservoir. Chen pulled up a schematic. The plant services the entire Eastern District, residential, commercial, and 3 major hospitals. If the contamination is what we think it is, we're looking at mass casualties before noon. What agent? Chen's hesitation told Nora everything she needed to know before the words came out. Preliminary analysis suggests a modified strain of cholera, waterborne, fast-acting, and engineered to be resistant to standard antibiotic protocols. The implications crashed through Nora's mind like dominoes. Cholera killed through dehydration, violent, uncontrollable fluid loss that could drain a human body in hours. In a population of 70,000 with limited medical infrastructure and no advance warning, the death toll would be catastrophic. Hospital medication storage was also hit, Nora said, reading further. What did they take? They didn't take anything. They contaminated it. Chen's voice was tight. Someone introduced a chemical compound into the IV fluid reserves at Mercy Ridge. We don't know what yet, but early tests show it's designed to interact with standard rehydration therapy. Nora felt ice forming in her chest. They created a trap. People get sick from the water, go to hospitals for treatment, and the treatment itself becomes lethal. That's the theory. And if they coordinated this with the power grid attack, which knocked out backup generators at 2 regional hospitals, we've got a perfect storm of cascading failures. Chen met her eyes. Someone spent months planning this. The Keller situation was just cover, a distraction to pull resources away from the real target. How long do we have? The contaminated water entered the system approximately 3 hours ago. Peak household usage starts in 90 minutes when people wake up, make coffee, shower, brush their teeth. First symptoms will appear 2 to 3 hours after exposure. By noon, we'll see the first wave hitting emergency rooms. Chen pulled up a projection model that painted the screen in shades of red. By 6 p.m., if we don't stop this, we're looking at 1,500 critical cases and climbing. The ambulance's back doors opened. Webb stood there, phone in one hand, his face carved from granite. We've got the perpetrators on camera. Facial recognition is running now, but initial analysis suggests military training, possibly former special operations. Let me guess, Nora said quietly. They served with Keller, 2 members of his original contractor team. They went underground after the Sand Viper investigation, resurfaced 6 weeks ago in the city. We had no idea they were planning this. Because everyone was looking at Keller. He was the loud threat, the obvious target. Nora's mind was racing, connecting pieces with the cold clarity of someone trained to see patterns in chaos. This was never about revenge on me personally. It was about creating maximum damage while proving the system failed. Failed how? Sand Viper happened because oversight failed, because people in power decided contractors were above accountability. Keller and his team killed 17 soldiers and walked away clean. This, she gestured at the maps, the projections, the growing crisis. This is them demonstrating that they can still hurt people, still operate with impunity, still win. Webb's jaw clenched. Then we need to prove them wrong. Chen was already moving, pulling up treatment protocols and resource allocations on multiple screens. I'm issuing a citywide water advisory. All taps off, bottled water only. Every hospital in the region goes to emergency protocols. We start setting up field treatment centers and that won't be enough. Nora's voice cut through the planning. You're reacting, not anticipating. They're 3 hours ahead of us, and they've poisoned the only treatment option. We need to get ahead of the infection curve. How? We need the antidote. Or more specifically, we need to know what strain they're using so we can synthesize a counteragent. Nora turned to Webb. The 2 perpetrators. Where are they now? Unknown. They've gone dark since hitting the water plant. Then find them. Use every camera, every database, every resource you have. Because they're the only ones who know exactly what they released into that water, and without that information, people are going to die by the hundreds. Webb was already on the phone, barking orders that would mobilize every federal agency in the region. Chen was coordinating with her team, activating emergency protocols that had been drilled but never implemented at this scale. And Nora stood in the center of it all, her ribs screaming with every breath, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity, and made a decision that would haunt her regardless of outcome. "I need access to Keller," she said. Everyone stopped, stared. "Absolutely not," Webb said. "He's in federal custody, and even if he wasn't, he knows his team's capabilities. He might not know the specific details of this attack, but he'll know how they think, how they operate, what their fail-safes would be." Nora's voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "And he knows I'll tell him the truth about what's happening. He might hate me, but he's not a mass murderer, not at this scale. He just held 17 people hostage. To get to me, to force a confrontation. This biological attack wasn't his plan. It's too big, too indiscriminate. His team went rogue, and if I know Vincent Keller, he's going to be pissed about it." Trent had been quiet, listening, but now she spoke. "She's right. Keller's profile suggests he's a narcissist with a persecution complex, but his previous operations were targeted, personal. This kind of mass casualty event doesn't fit his pattern." Webb looked between them, clearly torn between protocol and pragmatism. "Even if I authorize it, what makes you think he'll talk to you?" "Because I'm the only person who treated him like a human being instead of a monster." Nora met his eyes. "And because right now, I'm his only chance at redemption." 27 minutes later, Nora sat across from Vincent Keller in an interrogation room that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. He looked worse under the fluorescent lights, more hollow, more broken, the adrenaline crash of his failed hostage situation written across his face in shaking hands and hollow eyes. "Come to gloat?" he asked, not looking at her. "Come to ask for help?" That got his attention. His head snapped up, confusion crossing his features. "Help with what?" Nora laid it out in clinical detail. The water contamination, the hospital sabotage, the timeline ticking toward mass casualties. She watched his face carefully, cataloging every micro-expression, every tell. When she mentioned his former team members, his confusion shifted to something darker. "Marcus and Tommy," he said quietly. "I told them to stand down. After you showed up at the Blackstone, after we talked, I sent a message calling it off. They didn't get it, or they chose to ignore it." Keller's hands clenched into fists. "This wasn't the plan. We were supposed to force a public confrontation, make you admit the investigation was flawed. That's it. No civilian casualties, no biological attacks, just vindication. Vindication doesn't pay bills or erase criminal records. Your team decided to escalate." Nora leaned forward, ignoring the pain in her ribs. "They're going to kill thousands of people, Vincent. Children, elderly, people who have nothing to do with Sand Viper or military operations or any of this. And the only way we stop it is if you help us find them." "I don't know where they are." "But you know how they think. You trained with them, operated with them. Where would they go to ground after an operation like this?" Keller was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, "There's a warehouse, East Industrial District near the old rail yard. We used to stage equipment there during our contracting days. If they needed a place to hide out and monitor results, that's where they'd be." "You're sure?" "No, but it's the best guess you're going to get." He met her eyes. "Why are you doing this? After everything I did, why help me find redemption?" "Because redemption isn't about you. It's about the people who don't deserve to die because of choices neither of us can undo." Nora stood, the movement sending fresh pain through her torso. "And because someone once told me that in chaos, some people survive and some don't, I'm choosing to make sure more people survive." She left him sitting in the interrogation room, his head in his hands, and wondered if he'd meant any of it, or if survival instinct was just that strong. The tactical briefing happened in a parking garage that had been converted into a staging area. SWAT teams from 3 jurisdictions, federal agents, CDC containment specialists, and a handful of military consultants who'd been pulled from other assignments. The warehouse Keller had identified sat in a dead zone, between industrial facilities surrounded by chain-link fencing and decades of urban decay. The SWAT commander, a broad-shouldered man named Reeves, laid out the assault plan with military precision. 2 entry teams, simultaneous breach, flashbangs, and overwhelming force. We secure the suspects and any materials they have on site. In and out in under 3 minutes.
No, Nora said, and every head in the garage turned toward her. Excuse me? If you go in like that, you'll spook them. These are trained operators who've already demonstrated willingness to kill on a massive scale. They'll have dead man switches, fail-safes, contingencies. She moved to the map, pointing out structural details. This warehouse has multiple exits and a direct connection to the old storm drain system. You breach the front, they're gone out the back before you clear the first room. Reeves's face hardened. With all due respect, ma'am, this is a tactical operation. With all due respect, Commander, I've run extractions in hostile territory where the failure cost was measured in American lives. This isn't about tactics. It's about psychology. Nora turned to Webb. We need to draw them out, not drive them underground. How? The idea forming in Nora's mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only approach that accounted for who these men were and what they wanted. They're not just hiding, they're watching, monitoring news coverage, tracking the crisis response, waiting to see their plan unfold. So we give them what they want to see. We make them think they've won. Chen caught on first. You want to fake a crisis response failure, make them believe the contamination is working and we're overwhelmed. More than that, I want to make them think I'm coming for them, alone, desperate, trying to fix this without backup because the system failed again. Nora met Webb's eyes. They know my profile. They know I'll try to save people even if it means walking into an obvious trap. So that's exactly what we do. That's insane, Reeves said flatly. That's tactical psychology. You want them in custody? You want whatever antidote or information they have? You need them confident enough to stay put and engage instead of running. Nora pulled up surveillance footage of the warehouse. I go invisible, seemingly alone, offering them a deal. While they're focused on me, your team moves into position through the storm drains and secures the site from below. Trent was nodding slowly. It could work. If they think they have leverage, if they believe we're desperate enough to negotiate, we are desperate enough, Webb interrupted. But sending a civilian into a hostile environment is not protocol. Protocol is going to get people killed. This is about playing the hand we've got. Nora turned to Chen. How long until first symptoms start appearing? Chen checked her tablet. Based on current projections, we've got maybe 40 minutes before people start showing up at hospitals. Once that cascade starts, we won't be able to contain it. 40 minutes to find 2 trained killers in a city of millions and convince them to give up the one leverage they had. Nora had faced worse odds, but not by much. The warehouse district looked like a graveyard of industrial ambitions, rusted cranes, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls that had once housed thriving businesses. The warehouse Keller had identified was a 3-story concrete structure with loading bays that hadn't seen trucks in decades, and security fencing that was more suggestion than barrier. Nora approached on foot, wearing a borrowed jacket over her civilian clothes, a radio clipped to her belt broadcasting on a frequency she knew Marcus and Tommy would be monitoring. Behind her, 100 yards back and out of sight, 3 tactical teams waited for the signal. Marcus Chen, Tommy Rodriguez. Her voice carried across the empty street, amplified by the buildings. I know you're in there. I know you're listening. And I know you're watching this play out exactly like you planned. Silence. Then, crackling through a loudspeaker somewhere in the warehouse, Captain Hayes, or should we call you Nora? We were wondering when you'd show up. Marcus's voice. She'd met him twice during the Sand Viper operation, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a background in chemical engineering. Exactly the skill set needed to weaponize a water supply. I'm here to make a deal, Nora called back. We're not interested in deals. We're interested in watching the system that protected us, then abandoned us, then tried to bury us, finally collapse under its own incompetence. 70,000 people are about to get sick. Hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. Children, elderly, people who never served, never fought, never had anything to do with military operations or contractor oversight. Nora took another step forward. That's not justice. That's just murder. Justice is a luxury afforded to people with power. The rest of us get survival. Tommy's voice now, younger, angrier. You wrote a report that destroyed our lives, Captain. You want to talk about murder? Talk about the men who came after us, who hunted us, who made us disappear our own families to stay alive. I documented crimes. Your team sold intelligence that got people killed. We provided information in a complex operational environment. We were doing our jobs, and when it went bad, we became convenient scapegoats. Marcus again, his voice rising. Keller at least had the courage to confront you. We're going bigger. We're showing the world what happens when you corner people who know how systems work. Nora was close enough now to see movement in the second-floor windows. Shadows, shapes, the suggestion of weapons. Her hand moved slowly to the radio at her belt, keying it twice. The signal that she had eyes on targets. What's the end game? She asked. You contaminate the water. You poison the treatment. You watch people die. Then what? You think that vindicates you? Makes you heroes? It makes us remembered. It makes us matter. Tommy stepped into view at a broken window, assault rifle cradled casually. You took our identities, our careers, our futures. We're taking something back. You're taking innocent lives. There's no such thing as innocent. Everyone's complicit in the system that grinds people up and spits them out. Nora was calculating angles, distances, response times. The tactical teams would need at least 2 minutes to move from their staging positions into the storm drains, another 90 seconds to navigate to breach points. She needed to keep them talking, keep them engaged. I can't undo what happened at Sand Viper, she said, her voice carrying a weariness that was only partly tactical. I can't give you back the years you lost or the lives you had to abandon, but I can offer you something else. What? A choice. Right now you're terrorists, mass murderers, people who will be hunted and killed or locked away forever. But if you give me the antidote, if you tell me how to counteract what you put in that water, you become something different. You become people who pulled back from the edge, who chose to save lives instead of taking them. Marcus laughed, the sound bitter and hollow through the speaker. You think we want redemption? You think we care about how history remembers us? I think you're human beings who've been pushed into a corner and convinced yourselves that the only way out is through more violence. I think you're wrong. You would think that. You're the hero in this story, the virtuous medic who exposed corruption and saved lives and walked away clean. Tommy's voice was venomous now. You know what we got? Burned identities, death threats, families who can't even know we're alive, all because you decided to play investigator instead of doing your actual job. My actual job was saving lives. That's what I'm trying to do now. By walking into an obvious trap, by thinking you can talk us down like we're confused children. Marcus moved into view beside Tommy, and Nora felt her pulse spike. Both men were armed, both positioned where they had clear fields of fire across the approach. We know you've got tactical teams staging. We know this is a setup, and we know that the second we give up our leverage, we're dead men. In her earpiece, barely audible, teams in position, awaiting your signal. Nora raised her hands, showing them empty. Then kill me, right here. Pull the trigger and prove that you've become exactly what you accused the system of making you, people who solve problems with violence because they've forgotten any other way. Don't tempt us, Tommy said, but his rifle wasn't aimed at her anymore. It was pointed at the ground, and that small detail told Nora everything she needed to know about his internal conflict. The antidote, she said quietly. Give it to me. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, not for anything except the basic human decency of choosing life over death. You want to hurt me? You want to make me pay? Fine. Let me spend the rest of my life knowing that you had the power to kill thousands and chose not to. That's a victory the system can never take away. Silence stretched across the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Ambulance or police, another emergency in a city full of them. Then Marcus stepped back from the window. The strain is a modified cholera variant resistant to standard fluoroquinolones, he called out. But it's vulnerable to a combination therapy, azithromycin and zinc supplementation, administered within 4 hours of symptom onset. The IV contamination at Mercy Ridge was a glycopeptide derivative designed to trigger renal failure
when combined with dehydration. Flush the system, use oral rehydration instead of IV, and you save most of them. Chen's voice in the earpiece, urgent and professional. Copy that. Mobilizing treatment protocols now. Nora felt something unclench in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first suggestion that maybe this nightmare had an exit that didn't involve mass casualties. The synthesized antidote, she said. Where is it? There isn't one. We used commercial compounds, off-the-shelf materials. Everything you need is in standard hospital formularies if you know the combination. Marcus paused. We're not monsters, Captain. We're just people who got tired of being invisible. The irony of that statement, standing across from someone who'd spent 3 months trying to become invisible precisely to escape the weight of being seen, wasn't lost on Nora. Then come out, she said. Hands up, surrender peacefully, and at least you live to tell your side of the story. Our side doesn't matter. It never did. Tommy's voice was resigned now, all the anger bleeding out. We lost the second you wrote that report. Everything after was just delayed consequences. Movement in the windows, both men stepping back, disappearing into the warehouse's interior. They're moving, Trent's voice in the earpiece. Thermal imaging shows them heading toward the back of the structure. They're running. Nora was already moving, running despite the pain in her ribs, because she knew what came next. Knew it with the certainty of someone who'd seen too many operations end badly. All teams go! Go now, see! The storm drain entrances erupted with tactical teams moving in coordinated assault patterns. Flashbangs detonated inside the warehouse, their concussive force shattering what remained of the windows. Shouted commands echoed across the industrial wasteland. But Nora was heading toward the back of the building, toward where she knew there'd be an escape route, because people like Marcus and Tommy always had an escape route. She rounded the corner and saw them, 2 figures in tactical gear, moving fast toward a gap in the security fencing. Tommy was in the lead, Marcus covering their retreat, both of them operating with the fluid coordination of people who'd trained together for years. Stop, Nora shouted, knowing they wouldn't, but needing to try anyway. Marcus turned, and for a split second, their eyes met across 50 yards of cracked asphalt and urban decay. She saw in his face the same exhaustion she'd been carrying for 2 years. The weight of impossible choices and consequences that cascaded far beyond original intentions. Then he raised his rifle, not at her, at the ground between them. The burst of automatic fire stitched across the pavement, a clear message. This far and no further. We gave you the treatment protocol, he shouted. We gave you what you need to save them. That's more than anyone ever gave us. It doesn't have to end like this. Yes, it does. Because this is what we chose, Captain. Just like you chose to write that report, knowing it would destroy lives. We all make our choices and live with the consequences. Behind her, tactical teams were pouring out of the warehouse, weapons up, forming a perimeter. The window for escape was closing rapidly, and Marcus and Tommy both knew it. Tommy raised his own weapon, but not in surrender, in defiance. Don't! Nora said, but her voice was drowned out by the tactical commander's amplified order. Weapons down! Get on the ground now! The next 5 seconds unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a car crash watched in slow motion. Tommy swung his rifle toward the approaching officers. A dozen weapons fired simultaneously. Tommy went down in a heap, his body jerking with multiple impacts before going still. Marcus screamed, rage and grief and futility, all combined into a sound that was barely human. And Nora was already running toward him, hands out, shouting for the officers to hold fire. But Marcus wasn't raising his weapon at the police. He was turning it on himself. No! Nora's voice, raw and desperate, carrying across the distance. Their eyes met one final time. And in Marcus's expression, she saw not hatred, but something worse. A terrible, resigned sadness that said he'd known this was how it ended all along. I'm sorry, he said, though whether to her or Tommy or the universe itself was unclear. Then he pulled the trigger. The single gunshot echoed across the warehouse district, and Marcus Chen collapsed beside his partner, blood pooling on the broken asphalt. Nora reached them seconds later, dropping to her knees despite the screaming pain in her ribs, her hands moving on autopsy, checking for pulses she knew wouldn't be there, searching for signs of life in bodies that had already surrendered to death. "Get medical here now!" she shouted, even though she knew it was futile. Trent was beside her, gently pulling her back as a tactical team secured the scene. "They're gone, Nora. They chose this. They chose it because they saw no other option." Nora's voice was hollow. "Because the system backed them into a corner and then acted surprised when they came out fighting. They tried to kill thousands of people, and I stopped them, but I didn't save them." She looked down at the two bodies, men who'd once served their country, who'd made terrible choices and paid terrible prices, who'd become so lost in their own narrative of victimhood that mass murder seemed like vindication. Nobody saved them. Webb approached, his phone already pressed to his ear, coordinating the aftermath. When he hung up, his expression was complicated. "Chen's got the treatment protocol distributed to every hospital in the region. They're flushing IV systems and implementing the combination therapy. Early projections suggest we'll save 90% of potential casualties." 90%. Which meant hundreds would still suffer. Dozens might still die, because they'd been too slow, too reactive, too dependent on protocols that couldn't adapt fast enough. "The contamination at Mercy Ridge," Nora said. What's the status?" "Complete shutdown. They're bringing in clean supplies from regional reserves." Webb paused. "Your supervisor, Derek Moss, tried to override the shutdown order, said it was excessive and would impact patient care." Something cold settled in Nora's chest. What happened? Maya Chen, the senior nurse, filed a formal complaint documenting 3 months of harassment and falsified performance reviews. The hospital administrator put him on immediate suspension pending investigation. Webb's expression softened slightly. "Turns out when a nurse who just stopped a bioterror attack says someone's been sabotaging her, people tend to listen." "Good. There's more." The hospital board called. "They want you back. Full reinstatement, back pay for the suspension period, and a formal apology for—" "I don't care about apologies." Nora stood slowly, her entire body aching. "I care about making sure the night shift has adequate staffing and that patients get the care they deserve. They said you could name your position, trauma coordinator, emergency services director, whatever you want. I want to be a nurse. That's all I ever wanted to be." She walked away from the bodies, from the tactical teams processing the scene, from the ending that felt simultaneously like victory and failure. The sun was fully up now, painting Ashford City in the harsh light of morning, and somewhere in that city, people were waking up to news that would dominate headlines for weeks. The nurse who stopped a bioterror attack. The military medic who came back from the dead. The ghost who became real. But Nora didn't feel real. She felt like someone caught between identities, between who she'd been and who she'd tried to become, belonging fully to neither. The command center had been set up in a park near the contaminated district, and as Nora approached, she could see the organized chaos of disaster response in full swing. Treatment tents, triage areas, mobile labs processing samples. Chen was in the center of it, coordinating with hospital directors and CDC specialists, managing a crisis that should have been catastrophic but was instead merely devastating. When she saw Nora, Chen broke away from the cluster of officials. "The treatment protocol is working. Symptom onset is slower than projected, and the combination therapy is effective in all tested cases." She handed Nora a tablet showing real-time patient data. "We're establishing field clinics in affected areas, distributing oral rehydration solutions, and screening everyone who might have been exposed. It's going to be a long 48 hours, but we'll get through it." Casualties? Preliminary count, 43 severe cases, 8 critical, 2 fatalities, both elderly patients with compromised immune systems who were exposed early. Chen's voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of those deaths. "Without the treatment intel you got, we'd be looking at hundreds. 2 people dead, 2 families destroyed, 2 lives that could have continued if Marcus and Tommy had chosen differently, if the Sand Viper investigation had ended differently, if the cascade of choices and consequences had broken in any other direction." "I need you to do something for me," Nora said quietly. "Name it. When you write your after-action report, when you brief Congress or the CDC director or whoever asks what happened here, tell them it wasn't just about bioterrorism. Tell them it was about people who felt invisible, abandoned, scapegoated by systems that were supposed to protect them. Tell them that if we don't fix how we treat people when the cameras aren't watching, we're going to keep creating situations like this." Chen studied her face for a long moment. "That's not the narrative anyone wants to hear." "I know, tell them anyway." A commotion near the treatment tents drew their attention. A news crew had somehow breached the perimeter, cameras rolling, a reporter already launching into a dramatic stand-up about the crisis, and the hero nurse who'd saved thousands. Nora turned away before they could spot her, heading in the opposite direction, wanting nothing more than to disappear again. But Trent intercepted her path. "They're going to want interviews, press conferences, official statements about what happened at the Blackstone building and the warehouse." The agent's expression was apologetic. "You're news now, whether you want to be or not. Then I'll be news who refuses to comment. That won't make them go away. Neither will talking to them." Nora met her eyes. "I did what needed to be done. I helped stop people from dying. That doesn't make me special. It makes me someone who couldn't live with herself if she'd done nothing. Most people would have done nothing. That's what makes it special." Before Nora could respond, her borrowed radio crackled. Maya's voice urgent and professional. "Nora, if you can hear this, we need you at Mercy Ridge. We've got incoming trauma from a multi-vehicle accident, and we're short-staffed because half the team is dealing with contamination protocols. Can you come in?" The question was absurd. Nora had been awake for over 24 hours, had fought an armed hostage-taker, had confronted bioterrorists, had watched 2 people die, had cracked ribs and bruises and exhaustion that went bone deep. She keyed the radio. "On my way." Trent stared at her. "You're not serious. People need help. That's the only thing that's ever been serious." Nora started walking toward the street where emergency vehicles were still staged. "Besides, my shift doesn't end for another 3 hours. Might as well finish it properly." The FBI agent watched her go. This woman who'd spent 3 months being invisible and one morning being impossible to ignore, and wondered if anyone truly understood what kind of person chose to save lives even when the world kept trying to break them. Mercy Ridge Medical Center was controlled chaos when Nora arrived. The ER was flooded with contamination scares, people who'd used tap water that morning and were now convinced they were dying, plus the actual trauma cases that kept arriving because the city's emergencies didn't pause for bioterror attacks. Maya was at the nurse's station, her face lighting up when she saw Nora. "Thank God. We've got 3 incoming from the accident, multiple crush injuries, and Dr. Patterson is in surgery, so we're—" She stopped, really looking at Nora for the first time. "Jesus Christ, you look like you've been hit by a truck." "Feels about right." Nora grabbed scrubs from the supply closet, changing quickly despite the pain. "What do you need?" "Trauma Bay 2, 53-year-old male, steering column impact, suspected internal bleeding. We need to stabilize him for transport to County General." Nora was moving before Maya finished the sentence, muscle memory taking over, the familiar rhythms of emergency medicine overriding exhaustion and pain. The patient was exactly as described, middle-aged, terrified, bleeding internally, his vitals circling the drain. She worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in worse conditions. IV access, fluid resuscitation, pressure on the bleeder she located through palpation. The young resident assisting her kept staring, clearly recognizing her from news footage that was probably already viral. "You're the one who—" "I'm the nurse helping keep this man alive. Focus on that." They stabilized him, got him packaged for transport, moved on to the next case, a teenager with a compound fracture screaming in pain, then an elderly woman having a panic attack because she'd heard about the water contamination, then a construction worker with a laceration that needed 17 stitches. Case after case, hour after hour, the familiar relentless grind of emergency medicine that demanded everything and gave back only the satisfaction of keeping people breathing for another day. Somewhere around hour 3, Derek appeared in the doorway of the trauma bay. He looked diminished somehow, his confidence stripped away, leaving only a man facing the consequences of his own cruelty. "Nora, he started. She looked up from the suture she was placing. "If you're not here about a patient, leave. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you, for the write-ups and the—" You wanted to apologize or HR told you to apologize? Her hands never stopped working. Because there's a difference, and right now I'm too tired to care which it is. Derek's face flushed. I made mistakes. You made choices. You chose to belittle someone because it made you feel powerful. You chose to file false reports because you enjoyed watching someone struggle. You chose to be cruel because you could. Nora tied off the final suture, her movements precise, despite the tremor in her hands. Now you're choosing to apologize because you're facing consequences. That's not redemption. That's just damage control. I lost my job. And I nearly lost my life 3 times in the past 12 hours. I'm not going to feel sorry for you losing a position you were never qualified for in the first place. She turned to face him fully. You want to make amends? Start by learning that the people you supervise are human beings who deserve respect regardless of whether they meet your narrow definition of valuable. Until then, your apology means nothing. She walked past him without another word, leaving him standing in the doorway looking like a man seeing his own reflection for the first time and not liking what he found. Maya was waiting in the corridor, a slight smile on her face. That was satisfying to watch. Shouldn't have been necessary to say. No, but it needed saying. Maya handed her a tablet with patient updates. The board wants to meet with you, something about a formal position offer, and an alarm cut through the conversation. Code blue. ICU. Nora was running before her conscious mind registered the room number. Robert Chen's room. She burst through the door to find him seizing violently, the cardiac monitor showing a rhythm that was trying to deteriorate into something incompatible with life. The ICU nurse was good but overwhelmed, reaching for medications with hands that shook slightly. Nora took over without asking permission, her training overriding exhaustion. This was what she was good at. Making impossible decisions under pressure, finding the path through chaos that led to someone staying alive. 5 minutes later, Robert was stable again. Breathing. Heart rhythm normalized, alive against odds that kept trying to stack against him. As Nora stepped back, finally allowing the ICU team to take over, she felt something crack inside her. Not her ribs this time, but something deeper. The adrenaline that had been carrying her for hours finally ran out, and she stumbled, catching herself on the wall. Maya was there immediately, supporting her. That's it. You're done. No arguments. The shift is covered. You've done enough. Maya guided her toward the break room. More than enough. Nora sat in the quiet space, her body finally acknowledging the abuse it had endured. Everything hurt. Her hands were shaking. Her vision kept tunneling at the edges. Maya brought her water and a protein bar. Eat, rest, breathe. People are still sick. The contamination is being handled by dozens of professionals who are fresh and rested and not running on pure willpower. Maya sat beside her. You've saved more lives today than most people save in a lifetime. But you're not invincible. You're allowed to stop. Nora took a shaky breath, then another. The protein bar tasted like cardboard, but she ate it anyway because her body needed fuel, even if her mind wanted to keep pushing. I thought disappearing would make it easier, she said quietly. Thought if I became small enough, invisible enough, the weight of all those choices and consequences wouldn't follow me. But it did. It always does. So what now? Now I figure out how to be both. The medic who made impossible choices and the nurse who saves lives one patient at a time. The woman who was Captain Hayes and the woman who wants to be Nora Blake. She looked at Maya. If that's even possible. Possible? I just watched you stop a bioterror attack, talk down hostage takers, and work a full shift with broken ribs. If anyone can figure out how to be impossible, it's you. The break room door opened. Trent stood there, her expression unreadable. You need to see this, she said, holding up her phone. The screen showed news footage from outside Mercy Ridge. Hundreds of people, patients who'd been treated for contamination exposure, families of the multi-vehicle accident victims, even some of the hostages from the Blackstone building, had gathered in a spontaneous vigil. They were holding signs. Thank you, Nora. Heroes wear scrubs too. You saved my daughter. And in the center of the crowd, someone had set up a small memorial, flowers and candles for the 2 people who'd died from the contamination, and beside it, a photograph. Not of Captain Hayes in military uniform, but of Nora Blake in her pink scrubs, taken by someone at the hospital months ago. Invisible no more, whether she wanted to be or not. Maya squeezed her hand. The world sees you now. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Nora stared at the image, at the faces of people she'd saved without even knowing their names, at the evidence that her choice to stop hiding had rippled outward in ways she couldn't control. Then her radio crackled one more time. Trent's voice tight with urgency. Nora, we have a problem. Keller just requested to see you. He says there's something about the bioterror attack we got wrong. Something Marcus told him before they executed the plan. What did he tell him? He won't say. Says he'll only talk to you in person, right now. Nora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all settling back onto shoulders that were already carrying more than they should. She thought about saying no, about walking away, about finally choosing rest over responsibility. Then she thought about the 2 people who'd died, about the hundreds who'd gotten sick, about the possibility that there was still something out there, some other contingency or fail-safe that Marcus and Tommy had planted before their final confrontation. She stood, ignoring Maya's protest, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything except the cold certainty that this wasn't over. Where is he? Federal Holding Facility, 20 minutes from here. I'll be there in 15. As she walked out of Mercy Ridge, past the crowds and cameras and people calling her name, Nora realized something fundamental had shifted. She could never go back to being invisible. Could never again pretend that her past didn't exist, or that her choices didn't have consequences. But maybe that was okay. Maybe being seen meant being accountable. Maybe accountability was the price of making a difference. The federal facility's interrogation room was colder this time, or maybe Nora was just feeling her exhaustion more acutely. Keller sat across from her, looking somehow worse than he had hours earlier, more haunted, more broken, like whatever had been holding him together had finally snapped. There's a third component, he said without preamble. Marcus told me before I sent the stand-down order, before everything went to hell. Nora felt ice forming in her stomach. Third component to what? The attack wasn't just water and hospitals. There's a delayed trigger in the power grid sabotage, something that won't activate for 72 hours, but when it does... He looked up, and his eyes were filled with genuine horror. It's going to release the backup contamination into the city's entire water infrastructure. Everything we stopped today? It'll happen anyway, bigger, worse, unstoppable. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 72 hours. 3 days to find and neutralize a threat they didn't even know existed, or watch everything they'd fought for today burn anyway. Nora's hands clenched into fists, the pain in her ribs suddenly meaningless compared to what Keller had just revealed. Where? She asked, her voice deadly calm. That's the problem, Keller said, and the despair in his voice was absolute. Marcus never told me, and now he's dead, and Tommy's dead, and the only person who knew where they planted the final failsafe is beyond anyone's reach. Nora's mind was already racing through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as they formed. Marcus was a chemical engineer and Tommy had demolitions training. If they planted a delayed trigger in the power grid, it's not just about the electrical system. It's about what the system controls. Keller leaned forward, his chain scraping against the metal table. The water treatment plants have automated backup protocols. If primary power fails, emergency generators kick in and run a purge cycle to prevent contamination during outages. Marcus figured out how to weaponize that process. By pre-positioning contaminant in the backup systems, Nora finished, so when the power fails and the purge activates, it doesn't clean the water, it poisons it. And the fail-safe trigger is somewhere in the grid infrastructure. Could be any one of 200 substations across the Eastern District. Keller's voice cracked. I tried to stop this. When you showed up at Blackstone, when we talked, I realized how far off course this had gone. But they'd already committed, already planted everything. Webb had entered the room midway through the explanation, his face carved from stone. We've got engineering teams pulling schematics for every substation in the affected area. But if we don't know what we're looking for something that doesn't belong, Nora interrupted. Marcus and Tommy were contractors. They didn't have unrestricted access to secure facilities. Whatever they planted had to be small enough to conceal, robust enough to survive for weeks, and sophisticated enough to interface with industrial control systems. Trent was on her phone, coordinating with the power company's security division. They're pulling surveillance footage from every substation for the past 6 weeks, flagging any unauthorized access or maintenance anomalies. That'll take hours we don't have. Nora turned back to Keller. Think, when Marcus told you about this, what exactly did he say? Every word matters. Keller closed his eyes, clearly trying to reconstruct a conversation he'd only half believed at the time. He said the beauty of it was that even if we failed, even if we got caught, the system itself would complete the job. He said, Keller's eyes snapped open. He said, the old girl will take care of it for us. Old girl? Webb frowned. That's oddly specific phrasing. Nora felt something click in her mind. The original Eastern District Power Station, the one they built in the 1960s, decommissioned 10 years ago but still maintained as a backup facility. She pulled up a map on the tablet Webb had brought. Here, the Riverside Generating Station. It's been on standby status for a decade. Minimal security, sporadic maintenance, perfect place to hide something long-term. Webb was already issuing orders into his radio. All units converge on Riverside Station. I want bomb disposal, hazmat, and engineering support on site in 20 minutes. Make it 15, Nora said, standing despite her body's protest. We don't know the exact timeline. Marcus said 72 hours, but that could have been an estimate or disinformation. For all we know, it could trigger at any moment. Keller's voice stopped her at the door. Captain Hayes, I'm sorry. For all of it. For Sand Viper, for the hostages, for... His voice broke. For becoming exactly what you documented in that report. Nora looked at him for a long moment, this broken man who'd let his need for vindication destroy whatever humanity he'd once possessed. Sorry doesn't save lives, but maybe it's a start toward salvaging what's left of your soul. She walked out, leaving him alone with his chains and his choices. The Riverside Generating Station loomed against the afternoon sky like a monument to industrial obsolescence. Massive concrete cooling towers streaked with rust, turbine halls silent for years, a chain-link perimeter that had more gaps than barrier. The tactical convoy arrived in a cloud of dust and urgency, vehicles disgorging specialists who immediately began setting up command protocols. The facility manager was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Odom, who'd worked at Riverside since it was still operational and stayed on afterward because, as she put it, someone needs to remember what this place was. She met them at the main gate with a ring of keys that looked like something from a medieval dungeon and an expression that said she'd seen bureaucracy waste more time than malice. You're looking for unauthorized modifications to the backup control systems, she said, without preamble. I can show you 12 places someone with technical knowledge could hide something, but we'd need to check them all. We don't have time for methodical, Nora said. If you were going to sabotage this facility to trigger a catastrophic water contamination, where would you do the most damage? Patricia didn't hesitate. Control Room 3. It's the legacy interface that manages all automated backup sequences for the Eastern Grid. When we decommissioned the station, we left those systems active because dismantling them would have cost more than maintaining them on standby. She led them through corridors that smelled of machine oil and abandonment, past equipment that had been cutting-edge technology when Nora's parents were children. The control room was a time capsule, banks of analog gauges, manual switches, circuit diagrams hand-drawn on yellowing paper taped to the walls. And in the center of the primary control panel, something that definitely didn't belong. The device was elegant in its simplicity. A small junction box wired into the backup automation circuits, with a timer display currently showing 56 hours and counting down. Next to it, a sealed container roughly the size of a textbook, connected by reinforced tubing that ran down into the facility's infrastructure. That's new, Patricia said flatly. And that wiring job is amateur hour. Whoever installed this knew enough to interface with the systems, but not enough to hide their work properly. The bomb disposal technician who'd accompanied them, a calm, methodical man named Torres, approached slowly, scanning the device with handheld instruments. No explosives detected, but that container is under pressure. Could be compressed gas, could be liquid agent. Can't tell without opening it, and opening it might trigger a release. Can you disconnect it from the power grid controls? Webb asked. Not without knowing the circuit design. If there's a tamper switch, cutting the wrong wire could trigger immediate release instead of the delayed activation. Torres photographed the device from multiple angles. I need a schematic. Need to understand exactly how this integrates with the existing systems. Patricia was already unrolling circuit diagrams across a dusty workbench, her fingers tracing connections with the confidence of someone who'd lived with this equipment for decades. The backup automation runs through this junction here. If they wired into the fault detection circuit, any attempt to isolate the device would register as a system failure and trigger the automated response, which would activate the contamination release, Nora said, studying the diagram. So we can't disconnect it, can't move it, can't even touch it without potentially triggering exactly what we're trying to prevent. We could shut down power to the entire station, someone suggested, and trigger the fault detection circuit, Patricia countered. This system is designed to be fail-safe. Any interruption defaults to executing the backup sequence. Nora felt the pieces shifting in her mind, patterns forming from experience and training and the cold logic of people who understood how systems could be weaponized. Marcus was an engineer. He'd know that any obvious disabling attempt would be anticipated. So he designed this to be a trap within a trap. The device itself doesn't need to work perfectly. It just needs to make us so afraid of triggering it that we don't act at all. Meaning what? Trent asked. Meaning maybe the timer is the actual trigger, not a countdown to 1. Maybe this whole setup is designed to make us waste time trying to disarm something that's going to activate regardless. Nora turned to Torres. Can you determine what's actually in that container without opening or moving it? Torres pulled out a portable spectrometer, carefully positioning it against the sealed container's surface. The readings scrolled across his display, and his expression tightened. Chemical composition consistent with concentrated sodium hypochlorite, industrial bleach, mixed with organic compounds that I can't fully identify without a full analysis. Bleach in a water treatment system? Webb's confusion was evident. That's already a standard disinfectant. How does that help them? Nora's blood went cold. It doesn't help them contaminate the water. It helps them destroy the evidence of contamination. Bleach in high enough concentrations would oxidize the biological agents Marcus and Tommy introduced, make them undetectable in standard testing. So the water appears clean when it's actually compromised. Chen's voice came through the radio. She'd been patched into the operation from her mobile command center. By the time people start showing symptoms, the source has been chemically scrubbed and we can't trace the outbreak back to deliberate contamination. Which means legal accountability evaporates, Nora continued. No proof of criminal intent, no evidence for prosecution. Just a mysterious outbreak that gets classified as a natural occurrence or system failure. Marcus and Tommy would have been ghosts even in death. The implications rippled through the assembled team. This wasn't just about mass casualties. It was about creating an untraceable catastrophe that would undermine public trust in infrastructure itself. So what do we do? Webb asked, and the fact that he was asking Nora instead of his own specialist spoke volumes about how far her credibility had risen in the past 12 hours. Nora studied the device, the timer, the intricate web of wires connecting sabotage to system. We don't disarm it. We let it trigger. Every head turned toward her. That's insane, Torres said carefully. If that container releases into the water system, it won't, because we're going to isolate the facility's water connections before the timer reaches 0, then allow the device to trigger in a contained environment. Nora pointed to the infrastructure diagram. This station isn't currently processing water. It's on standby. The connections to the main grid are closed valves, right? Patricia nodded slowly, seeing where this was going. Manual shutoffs located in the pump house. We could close them completely, turn the station into an isolated loop. Then the device triggers on schedule, releases its payload into a closed system that goes nowhere, and we have a complete sample for analysis plus the device itself as evidence. Nora looked at Webb. Marcus designed this to be impossible to disarm safely, so we don't disarm it. We neutralize it by removing its target. Webb was quiet for a moment, weighing options. If you're wrong, if there's a connection we're missing, then we're no worse off than we are now, except we'll know for certain what we're dealing with. Nora met his eyes. This is what they did in the field when we encountered IEDs we couldn't safely disarm. Remove the target, let the weapon waste itself on empty space. Torres looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find a flaw in the logic. We'd need to verify every connection, make absolutely certain there's no pathway from this facility to the main water grid. Then start verifying. We've got, Nora checked the timer, 55 hours and change. Plenty of time to do this right. The next 6 hours were a masterclass in controlled precision. Engineering teams traced every pipe, every valve, every connection point between Riverside Station and the city's water infrastructure. Patricia proved invaluable, her institutional knowledge revealing backup connections and forgotten maintenance accesses that weren't on any official diagram. Nora worked alongside them, her medical training translating surprisingly well to understanding fluid dynamics and contamination pathways. She was checking a connection point in the pump house when Maya appeared, having tracked her down through sheer determination. "You were supposed to be resting," Maya said, handing her a bottle of water and pain medication that Nora hadn't realized she desperately needed. "I'll rest when the city isn't under threat of mass poisoning." But she took the medication gratefully, washing it down with water that had been tested 3 times for contamination. The hospital board came by again. They want an answer about the position offer. Tell them I'll think about it after we prevent a few thousand deaths. Nora marked off another connection on her checklist. "How's Robert Chen?" "Stable. Asking about the nurse who saved his life twice. I told him you were busy saving a few thousand others." Maya paused. "You know you can't keep doing this, right? Running from crisis to crisis, putting yourself in danger, never stopping long enough to heal?" "Can I?" Nora's voice was quieter than she intended. "Because it seems like the moment I try to stop, the world finds another emergency that needs someone willing to make impossible choices. That's not the world. That's you choosing to carry weight that doesn't all belong to you." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just someone who can't stand by when people need help." Nora finished her inspection, satisfied that this particular connection was truly isolated. Besides, who else is going to do it? Who else has the training, the experience, the complete inability to walk away? Plenty of people, but they're not here because they've learned to delegate, to trust systems, to accept that they can't save everyone. Maya's expression softened. "You're extraordinary, Nora, but you're also human. And humans break if they don't occasionally let someone else carry the load." Before Nora could respond, Trent appeared with urgent news. "We found something. Security footage from 6 weeks ago shows Marcus and someone else accessing the control room. The second person isn't Tommy." She pulled up the footage on a tablet. The video was grainy, shot from a ceiling-mounted camera that had been installed decades ago, but it clearly showed Marcus Chen working on the control panel while another figure stood watch. The second person was smaller, more careful in their movements, and when they turned briefly toward the camera, Nora's breath caught. It was a woman, mid-30s, dark hair, professional bearing that spoke of training and discipline. "Do we have ID?" Webb asked, crowding in to see. "Running facial recognition now, but the image quality is marginal." Trent zoomed in, enhancing what she could. Whoever she is, she knew where the cameras were. This is the only angle that caught her face, and it's only for a few seconds. Nora studied the woman's posture, her efficiency of movement, the way she checked corners before Marcus worked. She's not contractor. She's active military or intelligence. Look at the way she's scanning. That's counter-surveillance training, not private security habits. Which means this operation had backing we didn't know about. Webb's expression darkened. Someone with access to classified information about your fake death, about Keller's location, about infrastructure vulnerabilities. Someone who wanted this to succeed. The implications were staggering. This hadn't been just a revenge plot by damaged contractors. It had been a coordinated operation with support from inside the system itself. "Find her," Nora said quietly, "because if there's someone inside our own infrastructure helping to execute attacks like this, the Riverside device might not be the only failsafe they planted." The facial recognition came back 20 minutes later with a name that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Commander Lisa Vance, Defense Intelligence Agency, currently assigned to domestic threat assessment. She had top-secret clearance, access to classified military operations, and a service record that was exemplary right up until the point where it apparently became treasonous. More disturbing, Commander Vance's personnel file showed a connection to the Sand Viper investigation. She'd been part of the oversight committee that had ultimately granted Keller and his team their contractor immunity deals. She helped them escape accountability the first time, Nora said, staring at Vance's service photo. And when that started to fall apart, when Keller's immunity deal collapsed and he became a liability, she helped him plan one final operation. But why? Trent pulled up Vance's financial records. She's not hurting for money, no obvious red flags in her background. What's her motivation? Webb had been making phone calls, his expression growing progressively grimmer. When he hung up, his voice was tight with controlled rage. Commander Vance's brother was one of the 17 soldiers killed in the Sand Viper ambush. She blamed the investigation, blamed you specifically, for focusing on contractor corruption instead of the tactical failures that put her brother in danger. The room went silent. She thinks I got the wrong people, Nora said quietly. Thinks the real criminals were the commanding officers who planned the operation, not the contractors who sold it out. According to her service communications, which we're now obtaining through emergency warrant, she's been building a case for years that the Sand Viper investigation was a cover-up, that high-ranking officials sacrificed soldiers to hide their own incompetence and used Keller's team as scapegoats. Webb pulled up encrypted messages that had been decoded by NSA specialists. She's been in contact with Keller for 18 months, feeding him information, helping him plan this attack as a way to expose what she sees as systemic corruption. And she's still out there, Nora said. Still has access. Still knows about everything we're doing to stop this. As if summoning her by speaking the words, Nora's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered on speaker, everyone in the room instantly silent. Captain Hayes. The voice was female, controlled, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I'm impressed you figured out the Riverside device, but then you always were thorough in your investigations, even when you were investigating the wrong people. Commander Vance, I presume. I prefer Lisa. Rank seems meaningless when the institution that grants it is fundamentally corrupt. A pause. You're probably tracing this call. Don't bother. I'm using a relay that'll take you hours to unravel, hours you don't have. The Riverside trigger has been neutralized. Whatever you and Marcus planned, it's over. Riverside? Lisa's laugh was bitter. That was never the primary threat. That was the distraction to keep you busy while the real failsafe activates. Tell me, Captain, have you checked on your patients at Mercy Ridge recently? Ice flooded through Nora's veins. What did you do? What needed to be done? The medication contamination you think you stopped? That was phase 1. Phase 2 activates in the sound of a timer beeping. 37 minutes. Every IV pump in Mercy Ridge's ICU has been remotely reprogrammed to deliver a fatal overdose of the contaminated fluid still in the system. 23 critical patients, all dying simultaneously, all because the medical infrastructure you trust is as vulnerable as the water system you've been scrambling to protect. Nora was already running, shouting orders as she sprinted toward the exit. Webb and Trent followed, coordinating with hospital security and CDC teams, but Nora barely heard them. Her mind was calculating travel time, response protocols, the sheer logistics of evacuating or protecting 23 patients in 37 minutes. 36 minutes now. The convoy raced back toward Mercy Ridge with sirens clearing a path through afternoon traffic. Nora was on the phone with Maya, her voice urgent but controlled. Get every patient off IV pumps. I don't care if you have to manually bag them. Get those lines disconnected now. Nora, we can't just disconnect critical medications without replacement. The medications are poisoned. The IV pumps are compromised. You disconnect them or people die. She forced herself to breathe, to think tactically. Move the ICU patients to different floors. Spread them out so if the contamination triggers, it doesn't hit everyone at once. And get Dr. Patterson. We need someone who can authorize emergency protocol overrides. Maya's voice was steady now, shifted into crisis mode. Copy that. Initiating evacuation procedures. 32 minutes. Trent was coordinating with the FBI's cyber division, trying to identify how the IV pumps had been compromised. These are network devices. They receive programming updates remotely for medication administration. If Vance had access to the manufacturer's systems, she had access to everything, Webb interrupted. DIA clearance includes infrastructure security assessments. She could have mapped every vulnerability in the city's medical systems months ago. The convoy screamed into Mercy Ridge's parking lot with 28 minutes remaining. Nora was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, running through the entrance she'd walked through 12 hours ago as an invisible night shift nurse. The hospital was organized chaos. Maya had mobilized every available nurse, doctor, and technician. The ICU was being evacuated in controlled stages, patients moved on gurneys with manual monitoring equipment, IV lines being disconnected and replaced with emergency alternatives. But 23 patients in 28 minutes was an impossible timeline. Nora found Dr. Patterson in the ICU, coordinating the evacuation with the calm competence of someone who'd spent 40 years making life-or-death decisions. We've moved 17. 6 more still on critical support. We can't disconnect them without replacement systems, and we don't have enough equipment. Then we don't disconnect. We isolate. Nora was already assessing the remaining patients, categorizing them by urgency. These 3 can tolerate manual resuscitation if needed. These 2 need continuous medication, but we can switch to oral dosing. This one, Robert Chen, barely stable, requiring precise medication titration that couldn't be interrupted without risking another cardiac event. This one stays on the pump. But if the contamination is in the IV fluid, not the pump mechanism itself, we flush the lines, replace with confirmed clean supplies, and keep him running on manual monitoring. Nora was already moving, her hands working with practiced efficiency to swap out medication bags, flush lines, verify that every connection was clean. 22 minutes. Maya appeared with armfuls of supplies, other nurses following her lead. They worked as a coordinated team, every person knowing exactly what needed to be done because they'd trained for mass casualty events even if they'd never imagined the casualties would be their own patients. The evacuation continued. 18 patients clear, 19, 20, 15 minutes remaining. The last 3 patients were the most critical, all requiring complex medication regimens, all hovering on the edge between stabilization and deterioration. Moving them meant risking their already fragile conditions. Leaving them meant potential poisoning if Nora's countermeasures failed. She made the call. We move them. Carefully, slowly, but we move them. Get crash carts standing by in the new locations. If anyone codes during transport, we deal with it there. They moved the final 3 patients with agonizing care, everyone hyper-aware of the clock ticking towards 0. 10 minutes, 8, 6. The last patient was secured in a safe location with 4 minutes to spare. Nora stood in the empty ICU, staring at the IV pumps that were still connected to now empty beds, waiting for the timer to reach 0 and trigger whatever doom Lisa Vance had programmed into them. 3 minutes. 2. 1. The pumps activated simultaneously, their displays showing medication administration protocols that should have been delivering life-saving treatments. Instead, the contaminated fluids began flowing through empty IV lines, pooling on abandoned beds, filling the air with a chemical smell that confirmed everything Nora had suspected. Samples were immediately collected by CDC teams who'd been standing by. Torres photographed everything, documenting the attempted mass murder with clinical precision. And in the safe locations throughout the hospital, 23 patients continued breathing, their conditions stable, their lives intact because someone had refused to let a broken system break them. Maya found Nora standing in the empty ICU, her expression unreadable. We did it, the older nurse said quietly. All of them alive, all of them safe. For now, Nora's voice was hollow. But Vance is still out there, still has access, still believes she's fighting for justice by murdering innocent people. Then we find her. We will. But how many more fail-safes did she plant? How many more contingencies are waiting to activate? Nora turned away from the contaminated pumps, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She's not fighting us. She's fighting the system she thinks failed her brother. And you can't defeat someone like that with tactics. You have to change their entire understanding of what actually happened. Which meant Nora needed to do something she'd been avoiding for 2 years. She needed to fully confront the Sand Viper investigation, everything she'd documented, everything she'd tried to forget. Because somewhere in that classified nightmare was the truth that Lisa Vance needed to hear. The federal building's classified document archive was a temperature-controlled bunker that smelled of recycled air and institutional secrets. Nora sat at a secure terminal with Webb's authorization, pulling up files that had been sealed since the investigation concluded. The Sand Viper operation unfolded across her screen in painful detail. Troop movements, communication logs, the ambush that had killed 17 soldiers, including Commander Vance's brother, Lieutenant David Vance. Nora read through her own reports, reliving decisions made in blood and chaos. She'd documented Keller's team selling intelligence, but she'd also documented something else, something that had been classified so heavily that even she hadn't seen the final analysis. The tactical command decisions that had put those soldiers in the ambush zone were based on intelligence from multiple sources. Keller's team had sold their location, yes, but the orders to proceed despite warning signs had come from higher up the chain of command. And those orders had been given by Colonel Richard Stark, who'd been reassigned stateside immediately after Sand Viper and promoted to a Pentagon advisory position 6 months later. Lisa Vance had been right about one thing. There had been a cover-up. But it hadn't been to hide Keller's crimes. It had been to hide the fact that senior officers had ignored evidence that the operation was compromised because canceling it would have been politically inconvenient. Nora's investigation had documented the contractor corruption because that was what she'd had authority to investigate as a medical officer. The command failures had been handled through different channels that had apparently led to quiet promotions and buried findings. She pulled up one final document, the classified after-action report that listed all contributing factors to the Sand Viper casualties. Right there, in clinical language that sanitized horror, was the truth. Command had been warned. Command had proceeded anyway. Command had gotten people killed. And Lisa Vance had spent 2 years thinking Nora's investigation had let the real criminals escape. She doesn't know, Nora said quietly. Webb, who'd been reviewing the same files from a different terminal, looked up. Doesn't know what? That I documented everything. That the contractor investigation was just the part that got publicized. That the real cover-up happened above my pay grade, in classified reviews that never saw daylight. Nora turned the screen toward him. Lisa thinks I'm part of the system that protected her brother's killers. She has no idea that the system buried my findings just as thoroughly as it buried hers. So we show her the truth. If we can find her. Nora checked her phone. No new threats, no new calls, just the oppressive silence of someone waiting for the next attack. She's gone dark since the IV pump failsafe failed. Could be planning another contingency. Could be... Her phone rang. Same unknown number. You saved them. Lisa's voice carried a mixture of frustration and something that might have been respect. Every patient. How did you know? Because I understand how people like you think. You were never going to make this simple. Every layer has another layer underneath. Every solution reveals a new problem. Nora put the call on speaker, Webb recording every word. But I also understand something else. You're not a monster. You're a sister trying to avenge a brother who died because people in power made terrible choices. Silence on the line. I read the full Sand Viper reports, Nora continued. The classified ones. The ones that document exactly what you suspected. That command ignored warnings, proceeded with a compromised operation, and then buried their culpability by focusing investigations on easier targets. You're lying. Your report blamed the contractors. My report documented contractor crimes, but it also documented command failures. I recorded testimonies from survivors who'd warned their superiors that the mission was blown. I submitted evidence that the ambush location had been compromised through multiple intelligence leaks, not just Keller's team. Nora's voice was steady, factual, carrying the weight of truth. What I didn't know was that those findings were classified, sealed, and hidden in archives that would take federal authorization to access. Why would they do that? Because Colonel Stark went on to advise defense policy. Because admitting command failure would undermine public trust in military leadership. Because it was easier to prosecute contractors than generals. Nora paused. You were right, Lisa. There was a cover-up. But I wasn't part of it. I was a victim of it, just like you. The silence stretched longer this time. David was 26, Lisa finally said. He'd been in country for 4 months. His last letter home said something felt wrong about the operation, that his CO was pushing forward despite warnings. I read that letter after he died and spent 2 years trying to get someone to listen. No one would. I would have listened if I'd known you existed, if I'd known you were asking the same questions I was asking. We could have fought this together. Nora looked at Webb, who was frantically coordinating with cyber teams to trace the call. Instead, we both got played by a system that's very good at protecting itself.
So what now? You expect me to surrender? To trust that this time someone will actually hold the right people accountable? I expect you to stop killing innocent people who have nothing to do with what happened to David. I expect you to recognize that Marcus and Tommy and Keller twisted your grief into something monstrous. And I expect you to decide whether you want to honor your brother's memory with more death or with the truth. Nora's voice softened. David deserved better than to die in an ambush caused by command incompetence. But he also deserves better than to have his sister become the thing she hates, someone who sacrifices innocent lives for institutional goals. The call disconnected. Webb looked frustrated. The trace was scrambled through 17 different relays across 4 countries. She's using military-grade encryption. She's also thinking about what I said. Otherwise, she would have just hung up without responding. Well, Nora stood, her body aching, but her mind clear. We need to make the Sand Viper documents public, all of them. Strip away the classifications and show exactly what happened, both the contractor corruption and the command failures. That'll destroy careers. People who've spent years building reputations will face the consequences of their choices just like everyone else should. Nora's voice was hard. The only reason this bioterror attack happened is because Lisa Vance thought she was fighting against a cover-up. So we remove the cover-up. We expose everything. And we let the truth do what truth does, burn away the rot so something better can grow. The decision went all the way to Washington. Deputy directors and assistant secretaries and people with titles Nora didn't recognize spent 6 hours debating classification levels and national security implications. In the end, it came down to a simple calculation. Lisa Vance had already proven she could weaponize infrastructure systems. The only way to stop her was to remove her motivation. The documents were declassified and released simultaneously to major news outlets, congressional oversight committees, and military justice investigators. The Sand Viper operation was laid bare in all its complexity: contractor corruption, command failures, systematic cover-ups that had allowed guilty parties on both sides to escape accountability. Colonel Richard Stark's name was prominently featured. His advisory position at the Pentagon lasted approximately 6 hours after publication before he was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for everyone involved in the original cover-up. And somewhere in the city, Lisa Vance watched the news break and made a decision that would determine whether she'd be remembered as a terrorist or as a whistleblower who'd gone too far. Nora was back at Mercy Ridge when the call came. Not from Lisa this time, but from Patricia at the Riverside facility. The timer just hit 0, the facility manager said, her voice tight. The device triggered, released its payload into our isolated system exactly as you predicted. Any breaches? Any connections to the main grid we missed? None. The whole thing dumped into a closed loop that goes nowhere. We've got samples for analysis and the device itself intact for evidence. Patricia paused. You were right. It wasn't about succeeding, it was about making us too afraid to try. Marcus understood systems, understood that fear of consequences could be as paralyzing as actual threats. Nora looked out the window at the city, still standing, still breathing, still alive despite everything thrown at it. But fear only works if you let it make your decisions. She ended the call and found herself facing Derek, who'd apparently been reinstated long enough to collect his belongings and face termination proceedings. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by consequences. They're saying you're a hero, he said quietly. Stopped a terrorist attack, saved hundreds of lives, exposed military corruption. All while working a night shift at a hospital where I told everyone you were useless. You told everyone I was useless because you needed someone beneath you to prove you had power. Nora's voice wasn't angry, just tired. The tragedy is that you actually believed it. I'm sorry, for what it's worth. It's worth exactly what you make it worth.
If you learn from this, if you become someone who lifts people up instead of pushing them down, then maybe your apology means something. If you just move on to another position and another victim, then it's just words. She turned to walk away, then paused. The people you supervise aren't beneath you. They're beside you. Remember that wherever you go next. Night had fallen by the time Nora finally allowed herself to stop moving. The hospital was returning to normal operations, patients stable, systems verified, the crisis receding into the kind of bureaucratic aftermath that would take months to fully process. She sat in the same break room where she'd hidden for 3 months, trying to be invisible, trying to escape the weight of being Captain Hayes. Maya joined her, bringing coffee that was terrible but caffeinated. "The board approved your position," the older nurse said. "Trauma coordinator, emergency services director, or head of nursing. Your choice. I choose night shift, same as before." "Nora, I'm good at it, Maya. I'm good at being there when everything falls apart, when the easy answers don't work, when someone needs to make impossible choices. That's night shift. That's where I belong." Maya was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. The night shift just got assigned a new supervisor, someone with actual medical experience who believes in supporting her team instead of undermining them. "I think you'll get along." "Who?" "You're looking at her. Turns out decades of experience counts for something when hospital boards are trying to prevent PR disasters." Maya's expression turned serious. "But I'm not going to let you hide anymore. You're done being invisible. This city knows who you are now, and that means you're going to have to figure out how to be both Captain Hayes and Nora Blake without losing yourself in either identity." Before Nora could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The documents you released showed me the truth. Thank you for that. I'm turning myself into federal custody. But first I need to tell you something. There's one more fail-safe. Not mine. Marcus planted it before I met him. Something about Mercy Ridge's foundation. I don't know the details. I'm sorry." Nora's blood went cold. "We need to evacuate," she said, already standing. "Now." Maya grabbed her arm. "Evacuate what? Based on a text from a known terrorist?" "Based on the fact that Marcus Chen spent 6 weeks planning this operation and had access to building schematics going back decades." Nora pulled up the hospital's structural diagrams on her phone. Mercy Ridge was built in 1973. The foundation work included a network of utility tunnels that were never properly sealed when the building was expanded. "You think he planted something in the foundation?" "I think if you wanted to create maximum casualties in a medical facility, you wouldn't target patients you could evacuate. You'd target the structure itself." Nora was already running toward the administration office, Maya close behind. "We need to get building security and structural engineers down into those tunnels. We need to..." The explosion was small, precise, and placed with surgical accuracy to sever 3 critical support columns in Mercy Ridge's eastern wing. The building shuddered, alarms screamed, and somewhere in the administration office, emergency protocols activated that would trigger a full evacuation of all 7 floors. But evacuation took time, and time was the one thing they no longer had. The building groaned like a dying animal, its structural integrity compromised in ways that would take engineers hours to fully assess and seconds to become catastrophic. Nora's mind shifted instantly into crisis mode, calculating patient locations, evacuation routes, the physics of partial building collapse, and what it meant for the hundreds of people currently occupying 7 floors of medical facility. Maya was already on the hospital-wide intercom, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Code Gray, Eastern Wing. All personnel initiate emergency evacuation protocols. This is not a drill. Patients unable to ambulate require immediate assisted evacuation. All available staff report to staging coordinators." The response was immediate but inadequate. Mercy Ridge housed 247 patients across multiple departments: ICU, surgical recovery, oncology, geriatrics. Moving that many people, many of them critically ill or physically unable to walk, through compromised corridors while the building threatened to collapse, required more personnel than the night shift could provide. Nora was already moving toward the Eastern Wing's most vulnerable population, the ICU patients they'd just finished relocating from the IV pump contamination, now facing a new threat that made the previous one seem almost merciful by comparison. Dr. Patterson met her in the corridor, his face pale but controlled. Structural assessment says we have maybe 20 minutes before the compromised supports fail completely. The eastern wing will pancake down into the foundation, and the impact could destabilize the entire building. Then we move everyone in 15. Nora grabbed a patient roster from the nurses' station. Critical patients first, the ones who can't survive any delay. Then surgical recovery, then general population. Anyone who can walk under their own power evacuates immediately through the western stairwells. We don't have enough staff. Then we get more. Nora pulled out her phone, dialing Webb's direct line. I need every federal agent, every police officer, every first responder within 5 miles at Mercy Ridge immediately. We have a building about to collapse and 200 patients who need evacuation. Webb didn't waste time on questions. Mobilizing now. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes. 13 minutes of stability remaining. The math was brutal but simple. They needed to move faster than structural physics allowed or people would die. Nora coordinated with Maya and Dr. Patterson, dividing the building into zones, assigning personnel based on capability and patient needs. The ICU patients, 23 of them, all critical, became her personal responsibility. Robert Chen looked up as she entered his room, fear evident in his eyes, but his voice steady.
This is about what you stopped earlier, isn't it? The attack? This is about finishing what we started, keeping you alive. Nora disconnected his monitors, preparing him for transport. Can you hold your own oxygen mask? I think so. Then you're mobile. We're getting you out of here. She moved through the ICU with practiced efficiency, assessing each patient, making triage decisions that would haunt her if she let them, but couldn't afford to hesitate over. Some could be moved on gurneys with minimal support. Others required manual ventilation during transport. 2 were so unstable that moving them was nearly as dangerous as leaving them. Nearly. Everyone moves, she said when a young resident suggested leaving the unstable patients for the final evacuation wave. I don't care how risky transport is. It's less risky than being crushed when this building comes down.
The federal agents arrived like a small army, Webb leading tactical teams, Trent coordinating with hospital security. Dozens of trained personnel who could follow orders and move quickly. They spread through the building in organized waves, each team assigned to specific patient populations. Nora led the ICU evacuation personally, moving from room to room, ensuring each patient was properly stabilized for transport before sending them with escorts toward the western stairwells. The building continued its ominous groaning, stress fractures appearing in walls, ceiling tiles falling with increasing frequency. 12 minutes. The first wave of patients reached the ground floor safely. News crews had already assembled outside, cameras capturing the dramatic evacuation, reporters speculating about what was happening inside. The story was writing itself in real time. The hero nurse who'd stopped a bioterror attack now leading evacuations from a building sabotaged by the same terrorists. Nora didn't care about the narrative. She cared about the elderly woman in room 347 who just had open-heart surgery and couldn't be moved quickly without risking hemorrhage. She cared about the teenager in 312 recovering from a car accident, terrified and calling for parents who were stuck behind police barricades. She cared about every single life that depended on her making the right decisions in the shrinking window before physics made those decisions irrelevant. 10 minutes. The second wave cleared. 180 patients evacuated, 67 remaining. The eastern wing was visibly sagging now, the compromised supports failing incrementally, each small collapse bringing the catastrophic failure closer. Maya appeared at her side, helping to guide a gurney carrying a woman in her 80s. We're not going to make it. There's too little time. We make the time. Nora checked her mental map of remaining patients. The surgical recovery ward still has 18 patients. Once they're clear, we can... A support beam in the corridor ahead gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The ceiling collapsed in a shower of acoustic tiles and rebar, blocking the primary evacuation route. 8 minutes. Secondary route through radiology, Dr. Patterson called out, already redirecting the evacuation flow. It's longer, but structurally sound. Longer meant slower. Slower meant not everyone would make it. Nora refused to accept that arithmetic. She moved faster, worked harder, made decisions with a speed that came from battlefield experience where hesitation measured in heartbeats could mean the difference between survival and casualty. The surgical recovery ward evacuated in controlled chaos, nurses and agents working in perfect coordination to move patients who'd been sedated, who were still bleeding from procedures, who were barely conscious but alive and needing to stay that way. Each gurney that cleared the eastern wing was a small victory against the clock and gravity and Marcus Chen's final act of revenge. 5 minutes. 32 patients remaining, scattered across 3 floors. The building was failing faster now, the initial explosion having started a cascade of structural failures that accelerated with each passing minute. Windows cracked. Water pipes burst. The groaning became a shriek. Nora was on the 4th floor, helping evacuate an oncology patient too weak to walk, when she heard it. A child's voice, crying, coming from a room that should have been empty according to the evacuation roster. She diverted from the evacuation route, following the sound to a pediatric observation room. Inside, a girl, maybe 7 years old, sat in a bed, attached to monitors, tears streaming down her face. "Where's your nurse?" Nora asked, already checking the girl's chart. Observation for suspected appendicitis. Admitted 3 hours ago, somehow missed in the initial evacuation count. "She went to get my mom, said she'd be right back, but then the alarm started and..." The girl's voice broke. "I can't find the call button and I don't know what to do." 3 minutes. Nora disconnected the monitors, scooped the girl into her arms despite her screaming ribs, and ran. Not toward the clogged secondary evacuation route, but toward an emergency fire exit she remembered from her night shifts. Rarely used, probably not fully code compliant, but direct and unobstructed. The stairwell was dark, emergency lighting flickering. The building shuddered around them, and the girl buried her face in Nora's shoulder, whimpering with fear that was entirely justified. "What's your name?" Nora asked, taking the stairs as fast as she dared with her burden. "Sophie." "Okay, Sophie, I'm Nora. I'm a nurse here, and I'm going to get you out safely. But I need you to hold on tight and trust me. Can you do that?" Small arms wrapped around her neck with desperate strength. "Don't let me fall." "Never." 2 minutes. They reached the ground floor just as the Eastern Wing's primary support structure finally surrendered to physics. The collapse was both sudden and gradual, a cascading failure that started at the explosion site and rippled outward, each floor pancaking down onto the one below in a domino effect of concrete and steel and destroyed infrastructure. Nora burst through the fire exit into the parking lot, Sophie still clutched against her chest, running as debris rained down behind them. She cleared the collapse zone by maybe 20 feet before the final section came down, the impact sending a shockwave that knocked her to her knees. She turned, still holding Sophie, and watched the eastern wing of Mercy Ridge Medical Center reduce itself to rubble in a cloud of dust and destruction. And somewhere in that cloud, she prayed that everyone had made it out. The silence after the collapse was absolute, broken only by car alarms triggered by the shockwave and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. Then, cutting through the dust and chaos, Maya's voice on a megaphone conducting roll call. Every department, every floor, every patient. The count took 6 agonizing minutes, during which Nora held Sophie and stared at the ruins and calculated how many people could have been trapped in those final moments. When Maya finally lowered the megaphone, her face was streaked with tears and dust, but her voice was steady. All patients accounted for, all staff accounted for, 0 casualties from the collapse. The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd, patients, staff, first responders, even some of the news crews, was deafening. People who'd been strangers an hour ago embraced like family. Nurses who'd worked together for years sobbed with relief. And federal agents who'd responded to what should have been a routine assistance call found themselves part of something that would define the rest of their careers. Nora felt Sophie's mother find them, watched the reunion, accepted gratitude she didn't feel she'd earned because she'd just been doing what needed to be done. Webb appeared through the dust, his tactical gear covered in debris. "Lisa Vance just surrendered to federal custody. Walked into our field office downtown an hour ago with a full confession and documentation of everything Marcus planted. She said..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. She said you showed her that being right about corruption doesn't justify becoming what you're fighting against. Is that going to be enough? Her cooperation? Enough to avoid death penalty, probably. Enough to avoid spending the rest of her life in federal prison? Webb shook his head. That's for courts to decide. But she's done hurting people. The fail-safes are documented and being dismantled. And the Sand Viper investigation documents are forcing accountability that should have happened 2 years ago. Colonel Stark's name was already trending on social media, not as a decorated officer, but as someone who'd covered up command failures that had gotten soldiers killed. Congressional hearings were being scheduled. Military justice investigators were opening cases that had been prematurely closed. The system that had protected people in power while sacrificing those beneath them was finally being forced to answer for its choices. Patricia called with an update on the Riverside device. Fully analyzed, its contents cataloged as evidence, the facility secured against any residual contamination. Marcus and Tommy's bodies had been released to their families, men who'd made terrible choices buried with military honors that felt deeply inappropriate but were technically their right. And Derek Moss, last seen collecting his belongings under the supervision of security, had submitted his nursing license for voluntary suspension pending ethics review. The complaints Maya had filed were being joined by others, nurses who'd suffered his supervision and finally felt safe speaking up. The sun rose on a city that had survived 3 separate attacks in 24 hours, and Nora stood in the parking lot of a partially collapsed hospital, watching the eastern wing smoke and settle, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 3 months trying to disappear, spent 2 years before that trying to escape the weight of being Captain Hayes. But the truth was simpler and harder than invisibility. She was both. She was neither. She was something new, forged in the space between military precision and medical compassion, between the person who'd documented war crimes and the person who'd saved lives one patient at a time. The television crews wanted interviews. The hospital board wanted meetings. The FBI wanted statements. Everyone wanted a piece of the hero narrative that was already being written in headlines and social media posts. Nora wanted coffee and 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. She got neither. The press conference happened at noon in a hastily assembled outdoor venue because the hospital's media room was in the collapsed section. Nora stood beside Webb, Trent, Chen from the CDC, and the hospital administrator, facing a wall of cameras and reporters who'd been covering the story in real time since the Blackstone building siege. The questions came in a barrage. How does it feel to stop a bioterror attack? Were you scared during the building collapse? What's next for you? Nora waited for the administrator to field the questions. This was his hospital, his disaster, his opportunity to control the narrative. But he deferred to her with a gesture that made clear who the story was really about. She stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. 24 hours ago, I was a night shift nurse most people didn't notice. I worked quietly, kept my head down, and tried to be helpful without drawing attention. Because I'd learned that being visible came with costs I didn't want to pay anymore. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But this city forced me to remember something I'd tried to forget. That invisibility is a privilege people in crisis can't afford. When something threatens the vulnerable, the sick, the people who depend on infrastructure and systems and other humans to keep them safe, someone has to step forward. Someone has to choose to be seen. A reporter called out, "Is it true you're former military? That you faked your death to escape a classified operation? It's true that I served. It's true that I documented crimes that powerful people wanted hidden. And it's true that I paid a price for choosing truth over convenience." Nora met the camera lenses without flinching. But I didn't fake my death. I legally changed my identity to escape retaliation from people who felt threatened by accountability. That's not heroism. That's survival. What about the accusations that you fabricated evidence during the Sand Viper investigation? The accusations came from people who wanted to avoid responsibility for getting soldiers killed. Now that the full investigation files are public, anyone can read exactly what I documented and decide for themselves whether truth looks like fabrication. Her voice hardened. 17 soldiers died because people in positions of trust betrayed that trust for money and ego. I documented that betrayal. The system buried it. And the consequences of that burial just played out across this city in attacks that killed 2 people and could have killed thousands.
The questions continued, but Nora had said what needed saying. She stepped back, letting Webb handle the tactical details, and Chen handle the medical protocols, and the administrator handle the building reconstruction timeline. Maya found her afterward, away from the cameras, sitting on a curb with a bottle of water that tasted like dust and exhaustion. "You didn't have to do that," the older nurse said. "The press conference. You could have stayed invisible." "No, I couldn't. Not anymore." Nora looked up at the damaged hospital, her hospital, the place where she'd tried to hide and instead found purpose. "The people who want me invisible want it because I make them uncomfortable. I document their failures. I survive their attacks. I refuse to quietly disappear when that would be convenient. So staying invisible just enables them." "What happens now?" "Now I go back to work. Once the building is safe, once we've relocated patients and established temporary facilities, I go back to being a nurse, because that's what I am." She paused. "But I'm also Captain Hayes, and I'm done pretending those identities are incompatible." The hospital board met with her that afternoon in a hotel conference room commandeered for emergency administration. They offered her every position she'd been promised before: trauma coordinator, emergency services director, head of nursing, even a newly created role of security liaison. Nora declined them all. "I want night shift," she said firmly. "I want to work with patients who come in when everything else is closed, when the easy solutions aren't available, when someone needs to make hard decisions with incomplete information. That's where I'm most useful." The administrator, a practical man who'd watched her evacuate a collapsing building, didn't argue. "Night shift lead then, supervisor authority, full autonomy over scheduling and protocols, and a seat on the Emergency Preparedness Committee. And Maya Chen as night shift director." "Done." He slid a contract across the table. "We'd be honored to have you continue serving this community in whatever capacity feels right to you." Nora signed without reading the details. The salary was irrelevant. The title was meaningless. What mattered was the work, the patience, the knowledge that when someone needed help in the darkest hours, she'd be there. The federal investigation took weeks to fully unravel. Lisa Vance cooperated completely, providing documentation that helped dismantle what remained of Marcus and Tommy's network. She pled guilty to domestic terrorism, conspiracy to commit murder, and a dozen other charges that would keep her imprisoned for decades. But her testimony also exposed the Sand Viper cover-up in ways that forced accountability at the highest levels. Colonel Stark was court-martialed, along with 2 other senior officers who'd knowingly approved the compromised operation. The contractor immunity program that had protected Keller's team was overhauled. New oversight mechanisms were implemented. The system was forced to examine how it had created the very monsters it then failed to contain. Vincent Keller remained in federal custody, his cooperation having earned him a cell instead of a death sentence, but nothing approaching freedom. He'd sent Nora one letter, forwarded through official channels, expressing something that might have been remorse or might have been self-justification. She never opened it. Some conversations had ended, and no amount of words could resurrect them. Marcus Chen and Tommy Rodriguez were buried with full military honors that their families insisted on despite the protests. Their graves were marked with service dates and awards earned before everything went wrong, memorials to the people they'd been before choices and consequences turned them into cautionary tales. Mercy Ridge's eastern wing took 4 months to rebuild, modern construction rising from the rubble of what Marcus's final vengeance had destroyed. The new wing was safer, better designed, equipped with redundant systems that would prevent single points of failure. But the real changes happened in less visible ways. Hospital protocols were overhauled to prevent the kind of supervisor abuse Derek had exemplified. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented. Staff training emphasized support over hierarchy. And every new employee orientation included a case study about the night shift nurse who'd been underestimated, dismissed, and nearly fired, only to save the entire facility from multiple existential threats. Derek himself disappeared from the medical community entirely. His nursing license was revoked after ethics review. Last anyone heard, he was working retail in a different state, as far from healthcare as geography and shame could take him. Maya thrived as night shift director, implementing changes that made the overnight hours less punishing and more sustainable for staff who'd been quietly burning out for years. Under her leadership, the night shift became the most requested assignment in the hospital, not despite its difficulty,
but because of the culture of mutual support she built. And Nora returned to work, wearing the same pink scrubs, walking with the same slight limp she'd affected for camouflage, but no longer trying to be invisible. People knew who she was now. Patients asked for her specifically. News articles mentioned her in contexts ranging from bioterrorism to healthcare reform. Medical journals requested interviews about her unique combination of military and civilian expertise. She declined most of the attention, gave terse responses when she couldn't avoid it, and focused on the work that had always mattered most, keeping people alive through the hours when hope was hardest to maintain. 6 months after the attacks, on a quiet night shift when the hospital was running smoothly and patients were stable, Nora stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts. A young nurse, fresh from orientation, maybe 23, approached nervously. "Excuse me, Nurse Blake? I have a patient in 412 who's complaining of chest pain, but his vitals are normal, and I'm not sure if I should page cardiology or—" "Show me." Nora followed her to the room, assessed the patient with practiced efficiency, identified the telltale signs of anxiety masquerading as cardiac symptoms. Not a heart attack. Panic attack triggered by being hospitalized. Start with breathing exercises, get him some water, and sit with him for 5 minutes. Human presence helps more than medication for this. The young nurse looked relieved and grateful. "Thank you. I was worried I was missing something serious." "You noticed the symptoms and asked for help. That's exactly what you should do." Nora paused. "What's your name?" "Emily. Emily Torres. This is my second week on night shift." "Torres." Nora smiled slightly, remembering the bomb disposal technician who'd helped analyze Marcus's devices. Common enough surname, but the connection felt meaningful anyway. "You're doing fine, Emily. Keep asking questions. Keep trusting your instincts. And remember that the patients who seem the least critical sometimes need the most care." She watched Emily return to the patient's room, saw the young nurse's confidence grow as she successfully managed the situation, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope that the system could actually work if enough people chose to make it better instead of just surviving it. The night continued its familiar rhythms. Traumas arrived and were stabilized. Medications were administered. Comfort was provided to people facing their darkest hours. And through it all, Nora moved with the quiet competence of someone who'd finally figured out how to be both warrior and healer, both visible and grounded. Around 3 a.m., during the quiet hours when the hospital held its breath between crises, Maya found her in the break room. "I got an interesting call today," the older nurse said, sitting down with 2 cups of terrible coffee. "A documentary filmmaker wants to do a piece about the bioterror attacks, specifically about the role you played." "Hard pass." "I figured, but she made a good point. There's value in telling the story of how systems fail and people step up. Might prevent future attacks if security vulnerabilities get addressed. Might inspire people who feel powerless. Or it might just sensationalize trauma for ratings." Nora sipped her coffee, grimacing at the taste. "My story isn't special, Maya. I just did what anyone with my training would do." "No. Anyone with your training would have followed protocol, waited for authorization, let the system handle it. You broke protocol, trusted your judgment, and saved hundreds of lives because you refused to let invisible people stay invisible." Maya leaned back. "That's worth documenting." Nora was quiet for a long moment, weighing privacy against purpose, invisibility against impact. "If I agree, I want control over the narrative. No hero worship, no military glorification. Just the facts. Systems failed, people suffered, accountability finally happened. And I want proceeds to go toward establishing better support systems for veterans transitioning to civilian healthcare careers." "I'll let her know." The documentary would air 9 months later, winning awards and sparking congressional hearings about infrastructure vulnerability and veteran mental health support. But that night, Nora just finished her coffee and returned to work. Because regardless of what stories got told about the past, the present still needed someone to show up. The shift ended at 7 a.m. with all patients stable, all emergencies managed, the hospital functioning exactly as it should when competent people were allowed to do their jobs without bureaucratic sabotage. Nora walked out into morning sunlight, her body aching from another long shift, but her mind clear. The parking lot where she'd once evacuated a collapsing building was peaceful now, the eastern wing fully restored, No visible evidence of the chaos that had unfolded months ago. Her phone buzzed with a message from Trent. Coffee sometime? FBI is starting a Veterans Liaison program and wants your input on design. Another message from Dr. Patterson. Medical conference in Boston next month. They want you to speak on crisis decision-making. Worth considering? And a final message from an unknown number that turned out to be Sophie's mother. My daughter wants to be a nurse because of you. Thank you for saving her and for showing her that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. Nora stared at that last message for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle into places that had been empty for years. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. She'd been terrified for months, terrified of being found, of being exposed, of having to face the person she'd been and the choices she'd made. Terrified that visibility meant vulnerability, that acknowledgement meant attack. But she'd been found, been exposed, been forced to face everything she'd run from. And instead of destruction, she'd found purpose. Instead of retaliation, she'd found respect. Instead of being broken by the weight of visibility, she'd discovered that being seen meant being able to help people who'd been invisible too long themselves. The hospital behind her was more than just a building now. It was proof that systems could be changed, that abuse could be stopped, that people who'd been underestimated could rise to meet challenges that should have overwhelmed them. It was proof that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone dismissed as harmless. Nora Blake got into her car, still the same aging sedan she'd driven for 3 months of invisible shifts, and headed home. Not to hide, not to disappear, but to rest, recover, and prepare for the next shift. Because the work was never finished. The vulnerable would always need advocates. The sick would always need healers. The invisible would always need someone to see them. And she'd finally accepted that she was someone who couldn't turn away from that need, no matter how much easier invisibility might have been. 3 months later, Nora stood in front of a congressional committee investigating infrastructure security vulnerabilities. She wore professional civilian clothes instead of scrubs or uniform, answered questions with factual precision instead of emotional appeals, and refused to let senators grandstand about heroism when the real issue was systemic failure. The attack succeeded initially because security protocols assumed external threats, she testified. But the greatest vulnerabilities came from internal access, people with legitimate credentials who weaponized their knowledge of systems. No amount of perimeter defense stops that. What stops it is accountability, oversight, and creating environments where people feel heard before they feel desperate enough to cause harm. Are you suggesting we're responsible for the actions of terrorists? One senator asked, his tone dripping with political calculation. I'm stating that Lisa Vance spent 2 years trying to get someone to listen to evidence of command failures that got her brother killed. When the system repeatedly dismissed her, she found people who promised to help her expose that corruption, and they radicalized her grief into violence. Nora met his eyes without flinching. That's not justification. That's causation. And if we don't understand the difference, we'll keep creating scenarios where hurt people become dangerous people. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Nora answered every question, provided documentation for every claim, and left the committee with no easy sound bites but plenty of uncomfortable truths. Afterward, in the hallway outside the hearing room, a young woman in military uniform approached her. Captain Hayes, I served in the same theater you did, different unit. I just wanted to say, the woman's voice caught. Thank you for not letting them bury what happened. My brother was one of the 17, and knowing that someone finally made them answer for it means everything. Nora accepted the gratitude she still didn't feel she'd earned, understanding now that accountability wasn't about personal credit. It was about ensuring that truth survived long enough to matter. The woman walked away, and Nora stood in the marble corridor of power, surrounded by the machinery of government that had tried to hide inconvenient truths, and felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Not vindication, not victory, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd done the right thing, even when the right thing had cost her everything, and that the cost had ultimately been worth paying. Back in Ashford City, Mercy Ridge Medical Center operated with renewed purpose. The night shift flourished under Maya's leadership and Nora's clinical expertise. Patients received care that was both technically excellent and genuinely compassionate. Staff felt supported instead of exploited. And on a quiet Tuesday night, 6 months after the congressional hearing, Nora Blake stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts when a familiar face appeared in the emergency department. Trent, no longer in tactical gear but still carrying herself with federal authority, accompanied by a teenager who looked terrified and defiant in equal measure. "Nora, sorry to show up without calling, but," Trent gestured to the girl. "This is my niece, Angela. She's been having some health issues and her regular doctor isn't taking her seriously. I was hoping you could take a look." Nora read the subtext immediately. A young woman being dismissed by medical authority, exactly the kind of invisible suffering that happened when systems prioritized convenience over care. "Of course. Exam room 3 is open." She led them in, took Angela's history with patient thoroughness, identified symptoms that should have triggered immediate investigation months ago. "We're going to run some tests, but based on what you're describing, this needs more follow-up than you've been getting." 3 hours later, with test results confirming Nora's suspicions, and Angela admitted for treatment that should have started months earlier, Trent pulled her aside. "Thank you. Her doctor kept saying it was just stress, just anxiety, just easier to dismiss than investigate," Nora finished. "I know. I've been there. The difference is now I have the authority to make sure it doesn't happen to other people." Angela recovered fully. Her condition caught before it became critical because someone had finally bothered to listen. She sent Nora a thank you card that joined dozens of others on the break room bulletin board. Testimonials from people who'd been invisible until someone chose to see them. Years passed. The attacks faded from daily news into historical record, studied in security courses and medical ethics classes. Lisa Vance remained imprisoned, her cooperation having led to systematic reforms, but unable to undo the damage she'd caused. The families of Marcus and Tommy received compensation that couldn't replace their lost loved ones, but acknowledged the system's role in creating the conditions for tragedy. And Nora Blake continued working night shifts at Mercy Ridge, training new nurses, implementing protocols, serving on committees that shaped healthcare policy, and showing up every single shift to do the quiet, essential work of keeping people alive through their darkest hours. She never remarried, never sought recognition beyond what her work naturally earned, never tried to capitalize on her story for personal gain, but she stopped trying to be invisible, stopped pretending that being seen was dangerous, stopped believing that the price of making a difference was losing herself. On her 5th anniversary at Mercy Ridge, the hospital dedicated the rebuilt Eastern Wing in her honor, not with her name on a plaque, which she'd refused, but with a commitment to the principles she embodied. Competent care regardless of patient status, support for staff regardless of seniority, and the understanding that true healthcare meant seeing people the system had trained everyone else to overlook. Maya gave a speech at the dedication ceremony, her words simple but devastating in their accuracy. Nora Blake taught us that being underestimated is only weakness if you accept the estimation. She was dismissed as useless, targeted for termination, mocked by people who should have known better. And she responded by saving hundreds of lives, exposing corruption that threatened millions, and refusing to let anyone else suffer the invisible abuse she'd endured. That's not heroism. That's just what happens when you give a competent person the opportunity to do their job without sabotage. The crowd applauded. Nora accepted recognition with grace she'd learned to wear like armor. And later, alone in the break room during a quiet moment on the night shift, she looked at her reflection in the darkened window. Not Captain Hayes anymore, though that identity would always be part of her. Not invisible Nora Blake either, the ghost who'd haunted hallways for 3 months. Something new, something integrated. Something that had learned to be both warrior and healer, both seen and grounded, both exceptional and fundamentally human. She returned to work, checking on patients, reviewing charts, training the next generation of nurses who would carry forward the lessons she'd learned at such cost. The people everyone underestimates are often the most dangerous, not because they're violent, but because they refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose. And sometimes refusing to stay invisible is the most radical act of all. The shift ended at dawn. Nora walked out into morning light, her body tired but her purpose clear, heading home to rest before returning to do it all again. Because the work was never finished, but she'd finally accepted that the work wasn't meant to be finished. It was meant to be continued by people who refused to let the vulnerable stay invisible, who challenged systems that protected power instead of people, who showed up day after day to do the unglamorous essential labor of making the world slightly less cruel. She'd spent 2 years running from Captain Hayes, 3 months hiding as invisible Nora Blake. And every day since learning to be both, neither, and something entirely her own. That was enough. That was everything. That was the story of a woman they thought was just a nurse, until the world needed her to be so much more, and she rose to meet the moment without losing herself in the process. The sun climbed higher, the city woke, and somewhere in Mercy Ridge Medical Center, the next night shift was already preparing for the challenges that darkness would bring. They'd be ready, because Nora Blake had taught them how.